Imagine yourself standing in Mississippi in 1889. You're a formerly enslaved person, freed just 24 years earlier. You've spent those 2 decades working other people's land, living under laws designed to keep you poor and powerless. You've watched as Reconstruction's brief promise of equality was betrayed, as Jim Crow laws spread across the South like a plague, as every attempt your community made to build something was met with violence or legal barriers. You've seen black men lynched for daring to vote. You've watched businesses burned for being too successful. You've lived with the constant knowledge that no matter how hard you work, the system is rigged against you. But then you hear about Oklahoma, Indian Territory, land that's about to be opened for settlement, a place where, for a brief moment in history, the old rules might not apply, a place where you could claim land, build something, maybe even prosper. It sounds too good to be true, and in many ways it is. But it's also real, and if you're going to have any chance at all, you need to understand how you got here and what made this moment possible. Let's go back to 1865. The Civil War has just ended. 4 million enslaved people are suddenly free. But free to do what? Most have no land, no money, no education, nothing but the clothes on their backs. The federal government promises 40 acres and a mule to help formerly enslaved people start over. That promise is broken almost immediately. Instead, most freed people end up as sharecroppers, working the same land they worked as slaves, for white landowners who pay them just enough to stay alive and in debt. But there's a brief period from 1865 to 1877 called Reconstruction, when the federal government tries to enforce real change in the South. Black men vote. Black officials are elected to state legislatures and even Congress. Black communities build schools and churches. For 12 years, there's hope that America might actually mean its words about equality and justice for all. Then comes 1877 and the compromise that ended Reconstruction. To settle a disputed presidential election, Republicans agree to withdraw federal troops from the South. The moment those troops leave, white supremacists take back control. Jim Crow laws spread like wildfire. Black people are forced into separate schools, separate restaurants, separate everything. Lynching becomes common. Black men are arrested on false charges and forced into convict labor that's slavery by another name. The brief hope of Reconstruction dies, and in its place comes an era of terror that will last for nearly a century. This is the world that Black Americans are living in during the 1880s and 1890s. This is why thousands of them look west to Oklahoma Territory and see possibility. Because in Oklahoma, something unusual is happening. The federal government has taken land from Native American tribes as punishment for some tribes siding with the Confederacy. This land is being opened for white settlement through a series of land runs where people literally race to claim parcels. And here's the thing that makes Oklahoma different. Federal law doesn't explicitly ban black settlers from participating. The first major land run happens on April 22nd, 1889. At noon, a gunshot fires, and thousands of people surge across the border into what had been Native American territory. They race on horses, in wagons, some even on foot, trying to claim the best land. By sunset, entire towns have been staked out. And among those settlers, racing alongside white homesteaders, are Black Americans staking their own claims. This isn't equality by any stretch. Black settlers face discrimination and violence. Many are forced off their land by white neighbors, but some manage to hold on. Some manage to build. And this becomes a pattern. Throughout the 1890s, as more Oklahoma land opens for settlement, Black Americans keep coming. They establish all black towns, places like Boley, Langston, Rentisville, Taft, towns where black people can live without white supremacy breathing down their necks. Towns with black mayors, black sheriffs, black businesses. By 1900, Oklahoma Territory has more than 30 all-black towns. This is unprecedented in American history. Nowhere else in the country are black communities able to establish this level of autonomy. But there's a complication. Oklahoma Territory is also being settled by white Southerners who bring their racism with them. The territory becomes a battleground between black hopes for freedom and white determination to maintain racial hierarchy. Violent incidents are common, but for now, for this brief window before Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907, there's space for black communities to grow. Into this complicated landscape comes a young man named O.W. Gurley. Born into slavery in 1868, Gurley represents everything that the architects of slavery said was impossible. He's educated, he's ambitious, he's brilliant with money. After emancipation, his family moved to Arkansas, where, against all odds, young Gurley got an education. He attended Wilberforce University in Ohio, one of the first black universities in America. He studied, he taught, he saved every penny. By the 1890s, Gurley is working as a teacher and principal in Arkansas, but he's watching events in Oklahoma with keen interest. He sees the land runs. He sees the opportunity. In 1893, he moves to Perry, Oklahoma, a small town that sprang up during one of the land rushes. He works. He saves. He invests carefully. And in 1905, he makes the move that will change history. He buys 40 acres of land on the north side of Tulsa, Oklahoma, in an area that will become known as Greenwood. Now let's pause here and understand what Tulsa was in 1905. It was barely a town. Founded in 1898, it had maybe a few thousand people, but something was happening beneath the ground around Tulsa that would transform everything: oil. The first oil well in the area was drilled in 1901. By 1905, more wells were being drilled every month. People were flooding into Tulsa, hoping to strike it rich. The town was growing at a breakneck pace, and O.W. Gurley, with the instincts of a born entrepreneur, recognized an opportunity. Tulsa was segregated from the start. The railroad tracks ran east to west through the town, and black residents were expected to live north of the tracks. White residents controlled the south side. This meant that black people working in Tulsa needed housing, needed services, needed businesses on the north side. Gurley saw this and understood. If he controlled land on the north side, if he could build a community there, he wouldn't just be providing a service. He would be creating wealth. So Gurley buys his 40 acres and starts developing it. He names the main street Greenwood Avenue, after a town in Mississippi where he had relatives. He begins selling lots to other black families. And here's the crucial part of his vision. He tells every buyer, every resident, spend your money with black businesses. Hire black workers. Bank with black banks. Keep the money circulating in our community. This isn't just moral philosophy. It's economic strategy. In a white-controlled economy, money spent with white businesses leaves the black community forever. But if black Tulsans spend with black businesses, who then spend with other black businesses, the same dollar can circulate through the community dozens of times, creating wealth at each transaction. This concept, sometimes called the black dollar, will become the engine of Greenwood's prosperity. But it only works if there are enough black businesses to support it. Which brings us to the second founder of Black Wall Street, J.B. Stradford. J.B. Stradford was born in 1861 in Versailles, Kentucky. His parents had been enslaved, but by the time J.B. was growing up, his father had managed to acquire some land and establish a small business. This was rare. Most black families in the post-war South had nothing, but Stradford's father understood something crucial. Land equals power. He worked himself to exhaustion to give his children opportunities he never had. Young J.B. Stradford excelled in school, but getting an education as a black child in the 1870s, Kentucky meant constant humiliation and danger. The schools for black children were underfunded, understaffed, often just a single room with a teacher who had barely more education than the students. But Stradford was brilliant and determined. He caught the attention of teachers who encouraged him to apply to college. In 1878, at age 17, he was admitted to Oberlin College in Ohio. Now, imagine being one of a handful of black students at a mostly white college in 1878. This was only 13 years after the end of slavery. Many of your white classmates have parents who fought for the Confederacy. You sit in classrooms where you're the only black face. You live in a dormitory where some students won't speak to you. You face constant reminders that much of white America believes you're inherently inferior. But you study anyway. You excel anyway. Because you understand that education is a weapon, the only weapon you're legally allowed to carry. Stradford graduates from Oberlin, then studies law. He becomes one of the first black attorneys in the Midwest. He practices law in Indiana, defends black clients who otherwise would have no representation, builds a reputation. But practicing law as a black man in the 1890s means constant battles. White judges who don't take you seriously. White juries who won't believe your clients. Whole legal systems designed to ensure black people lose. So, in 1899, Stradford hears about Oklahoma Territory and sees the same opportunity Gurley saw. A place where he might be able to build something without constantly fighting against white supremacist systems. He moves to Tulsa. And when O.W. Gurley starts developing Greenwood, Stradford immediately sees the potential. In 1918, Stradford builds the Stradford Hotel on Greenwood Avenue. This isn't a small boarding house. This is a 54-room luxury hotel with a dining room, a pool hall, a saloon. It's the largest black-owned hotel in America. Black travelers coming through Tulsa, businessmen, entertainers, anyone passing through, they can't stay in white hotels because of segregation. So they stay at the Stradford. And Stradford becomes wealthy. Not just comfortable. Wealthy. He employs dozens of people. He invests in other businesses. He becomes a pillar of the community. But Gurley and Stradford aren't building Greenwood alone. Let me introduce you to some of the other pioneers who made Black Wall Street possible. John and Lula Williams arrived in Tulsa around 1913. They had almost nothing when they came. John had worked various jobs, saved carefully, and had a dream of opening a business. When they saw Greenwood, they saw opportunity. They opened Williams Confectionery, a small shop selling candy and ice cream. It was modest, but it was theirs. The community supported them, and the business grew. Then, they opened the Dreamland Theater in 1914. The Dreamland Theater wasn't just a movie house, though it was that too. One of the first theaters in Tulsa to show motion pictures. It was a community gathering place. The Dreamland hosted live music, vaudeville shows, community meetings, everything. On any given night, you might see a jazz band, a touring theater troupe, or a local talent show. The Williams ran it with pride and professionalism. They employed local people. They gave young musicians their first paying gigs. The Dreamland became the cultural heart of Greenwood. Then there's Dr. A.C. Jackson. Let me tell you about this man, because his story captures something essential about what Greenwood represented. A.C. Jackson was born in 1878 in Memphis, Tennessee. He attended Meharry Medical College in Nashville, one of the few medical schools that would train black doctors. He became a surgeon, and not just any surgeon. He was brilliant. The Mayo brothers, who ran the famous Mayo Clinic, called him the most able Negro surgeon in America. Some accounts say they offered him a position at their clinic, which he declined because he wanted to serve the black community. Dr. Jackson moved to Tulsa around 1912 and set up practice in Greenwood. He performed surgeries that white doctors in Tulsa couldn't or wouldn't do. He treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. He trained younger black doctors. He saved lives. And he prospered. He built a beautiful home in Greenwood, raised his family, became respected even by white Tulsans who normally wouldn't acknowledge black excellence. There was Simon Berry, who started one of the first jitney services in Tulsa. Jitneys were early taxi services, basically cars for hire, before taxis were officially organized. Berry bought vehicles, hired drivers, and soon was running a profitable transportation business. He owned multiple properties in Greenwood. There was Mabel B. Little, who became the first licensed black female attorney in Oklahoma. In an era when women of any race struggled to practice law, and black people of any gender faced massive barriers, she somehow managed to pass the bar exam and establish a practice. She specialized in property law, helped black families navigate the complicated process of buying and keeping land. There were dozens of doctors, dentists, lawyers, teachers. There were shop owners, restaurant proprietors, hoteliers. There were people who started with nothing and built empires. And critically, There were the institutions that held it all together. Churches were the backbone of Greenwood's social structure. First Baptist Church, Mount Zion Baptist Church, and others provided not just spiritual guidance, but social services. Churches ran literacy programs, helped new arrivals find housing and work, organized community events. Sunday service was where the community came together, where business deals were discussed after the sermon, where social networks were maintained. Then there were the newspapers. A J. Smitherman founded the Tulsa Star in 1913. This wasn't just a business, it was a voice. The Star covered local news, celebrated community achievements, and wasn't afraid to criticize injustice. When a black person was discriminated against in Tulsa, the Star wrote about it. When the community achieved something, the Star made sure everyone knew. Smitherman used his paper to advocate for civil rights, to encourage black economic development, to keep the community informed and organized. The Greenwood Business Directory by 1921 reads like a catalog of black capitalism succeeding despite every obstacle America could throw at it. Let me walk you through what existed on those 35 blocks that would become known as Black Wall Street. Chapter 3. The Building of an Empire. Picture Greenwood Avenue on a summer day in 1920. It's hot, the Oklahoma sun beating down, but the street is alive with activity. Let's walk down this street together, and I'll show you what Black Tulsa built. We start at the southern end, near the railroad tracks that separate Greenwood from White Tulsa. Right here is the boundary, the physical line that segregation drew through the city. Cross these tracks going south, and you're in a different world. A world where you have to enter through back doors, where you can't try on clothes before buying them, where the nice restaurants won't serve you no matter how much money you have. But cross north, into Greenwood, and you're in a black world. A world where your money is good anywhere, where you're called sir and ma'am, where the businesses are owned by people who look like you and understand your struggles because they've lived them too. First building you see, the Stradford Hotel, 3 stories of brick and pride. The hotel is busy, a constant stream of guests checking in and out. Black businessmen from Kansas City, entertainers heading to the Dreamland Theater, families visiting relatives. The lobby has plush chairs, polished wood, newspapers from black communities across the country. The dining room serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The rooms are clean and well appointed. This is as good as any white hotel in Tulsa, and everyone knows it. Next door is Williams' Confectionery. The smell of fresh candy hits you before you even reach the door. Inside, Lula Williams is behind the counter, wrapping homemade chocolates while chatting with customers. Kids press their faces against the glass display cases, pointing at the candy they want to buy with pennies earned doing chores. The shop also serves ice cream, sodas, fresh-baked goods. It's packed every afternoon with children just out of school and adults stopping by for a treat. Across the street is Mann Brothers Grocery. This is one of about 40 grocery stores in Greenwood, but the Manns run one of the largest. Every kind of food you need. Fresh produce, canned goods, meat from the butcher and back, dry goods, everything. The Manns know their customers by name, run accounts for families who are short until payday, donate food to families hit by hard times. This isn't just business, it's community. Walk another block and you see a row of professional offices. Lawyers, doctors, dentists, insurance agents. Each office has a brass plaque by the door with the professional's name. These aren't storefront operations. These are real offices with waiting rooms, secretaries, proper furnishings. Dr. Jackson's surgery is here. His waiting room is always full. People come from all over Oklahoma because they trust him more than white doctors. His success rates are better. His bedside manner is respectful, and he'll perform procedures that white hospitals won't do for black patients. The law offices are busy too. Black people in Oklahoma need lawyers constantly. Property disputes, discrimination cases, contracts, wills, fighting false criminal charges. The black lawyers of Greenwood are kept busy defending their community against a legal system designed to disadvantage them. And they win cases. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough to make a difference. enough to protect some families from losing everything. Further up Greenwood Avenue is the Dreamland Theater. During the day, it's quiet, but at night, it comes alive. The marquee announces what's showing. Sometimes a motion picture, sometimes a live show. The theater seats about 750 people. On a Friday or Saturday night, it's packed. The community dresses up for the theater. Men in their best suits, women in elegant dresses. This is a place to see and be seen. Young couples court here. Families make it a weekly tradition. The Dreamland is where Greenwood shows itself at its finest. Jazz musicians play at the Dreamland regularly. This is the Jazz Age, and Greenwood has its own scene. Local musicians and traveling acts. The blues clubs and jazz joints don't open until after dark, but everyone knows they're there. The music scene in Greenwood rivals anything in Kansas City or Chicago. White Tulsans sometimes sneak across the tracks to hear the music, though they'd never admit it publicly. The churches are scattered throughout Greenwood, and each one is magnificent in its own way. Mount Zion Baptist Church is the largest, with a congregation of over 600. First Baptist isn't far behind. These churches aren't just Sunday morning affairs. They're community centers. Wednesday prayer meetings, Saturday youth programs, Sunday school, choir practice, social clubs, charity drives. The churches are where community decisions get made, where leaders emerge, where the social fabric of Greenwood is woven together. Booker T. Washington High School is the crown jewel of Greenwood's educational system. Built in 1913, it's a proper high school with multiple teachers, a full curriculum, a library, science labs. The school emphasizes both practical skills and classical education. Students learn trades, carpentry, mechanics, sewing, but they also study Latin, literature, mathematics, science. The message is clear. Black students can and should receive the same quality education as anyone else. The graduation rate at Booker T. Washington is higher than the national average for black schools. Many graduates go on to college. Some return to Greenwood as teachers, doctors, lawyers, continuing the cycle of community investment. The banks deserve special mention. The Greenwood State Bank isn't the biggest bank in Tulsa, but it's the only one that will give black people fair terms on loans. White banks either refuse black customers entirely or charge predatory interest rates. The Greenwood Bank is where community members save money, where businesses get loans to expand, where mortgages are written for families buying homes. This institution holds the financial foundation of Black Wall Street. By 1921, the bank has deposits totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. That money comes from businesses doing well, from doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs, and the bank loans that money back into the community. A young couple wants to buy a house. The bank helps. A business owner wants to expand. The bank helps. This circular flow of money within Greenwood is what creates its prosperity. The wealth visible in Greenwood by 1921 is staggering given the historical context. Remember, many of these families are just 1 or 2 generations removed from slavery. Their grandparents owned nothing, had nothing, were legally considered property. Yet here, in 1921, you see homes with indoor plumbing and electricity. In an era when many rural Americans still use outhouses and oil lamps, Greenwood residents have modern conveniences. Some homes have pianos, fine furniture imported from other states, phonographs with record collections. The houses themselves range from modest but well-kept cottages to substantial 2-story homes that would fit in any wealthy white neighborhood. Cars are everywhere. Ford Model Ts mostly, but also some luxury vehicles. Black Tulsans buy cars not just for transportation, but as symbols of success. On Sunday mornings, you see families driving to church in their best clothes in their own automobiles. This is freedom of a kind their parents never knew. The total property value in Greenwood by 1921 is estimated at over $2 million, about $35 million in today's dollars. Individual families have net worths of $100,000 or more, equivalent to about $1.7 million today. These aren't plantation owners or heirs to family fortunes. These are people who started with nothing and built wealth through intelligence, hard work, and community solidarity. The residents of Greenwood are acutely aware of how rare and precious this is. They know that in most of America, black prosperity is met with white violence. They've heard about Wilmington, North Carolina, where a thriving black community was destroyed by white mobs in 1898. They know about the countless smaller incidents of black businesses burned, black landowners forced to sell at gunpoint. They're careful. They're respectful in their dealings with white Tulsa. They try not to be too visible, too proud, too successful in ways that might provoke jealousy. But they also refuse to apologize for their success. Why should they? They've earned every penny legally. They've built their community through legitimate business, hard work, and mutual support. If white people are uncomfortable with black prosperity, that's a white people problem. This attitude is new, and it comes largely from the younger generation, especially the black veterans returning from World War I. These men fought in France. They wore the American uniform. They risked their lives for democracy abroad, and they came home expecting to be treated with dignity. Many of them settle in Greenwood, drawn by its prosperity and pride. They're less willing to bow and scrape to white supremacy. They talk about rights, about respect, about not tolerating discrimination. This makes white Tulsa nervous. You can read it in the editorials in white newspapers. Complaints about uppity Negroes. Concerns about black people not knowing their place. Fear masked as concern about law and order. The white establishment in Tulsa watches Greenwood with growing discomfort. Some white businessmen resent the competition. Some white workers resent black prosperity when they themselves are struggling. Some white people simply cannot accept that black Americans can succeed. But for now, in early 1921, Greenwood is at its peak. Booker T. Washington had visited Tulsa before his death and called Greenwood the most prosperous Negro community in the United States. It's hard to argue with that assessment. The businesses are thriving. The community is growing. New families arrive every month, drawn by news of Black Wall Street spreading throughout the black communities of the South and Midwest. On a Saturday night in April 1921, Greenwood Avenue is packed. The Dreamland Theater is showing a picture. The restaurants are full. The shops are busy with people buying groceries for Sunday dinner. Music drifts from the jazz clubs. People stroll the sidewalks, greeting neighbors, catching up on community news. Children play in the streets under the watchful eyes of adults sitting on porches. It's a scene of American prosperity, except everyone here is black. O.W. Gurley sometimes walks Greenwood Avenue in the evening, surveying what he helped build. He's in his 50s now, wealthy by any measure. He owns multiple properties. His initial investment of 40 acres has multiplied many times over. But more than the money, he's proud of the community. This is what he envisioned when he first bought that land in 1905. A place where black families could prosper, where black businesses could flourish, where black children could grow up seeing success that looked like them. J.B. Stradford feels the same pride. His hotel is the centerpiece of Greenwood Avenue. He employs dozens of people. He's respected throughout Oklahoma. He's proven that a black man can build something substantial, something lasting. Dr. A.C. Jackson continues his medical practice, saving lives and training younger doctors. The Williams continue running the Dreamland Theater and their confectionery. Teachers educate the next generation. Lawyers defend the community's interests. Ministers provide spiritual guidance. And ordinary families work their jobs, raise their children, save money, and dream of better futures. This is Black Wall Street in April 1921, a community of about 10,000 people living in 35 blocks that defy every racist assumption about black inferiority. A living refutation of the idea that black Americans can't build, can't prosper, can't create institutions that rival anything white America has produced. But none of them know that in just 6 weeks, everything they've built will be gone. The homes, the businesses, the churches, the schools, the dreams, all of it will burn. The streets where children now play will run with blood. The pride and prosperity visible on every corner will be reduced to smoking rubble and scattered ashes. And the people responsible will never be punished. The story will be covered up for 80 years. And America will forget that Black Wall Street ever existed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in April 1921, Greenwood Avenue is alive with possibility. The worst is yet to come. And when it does come, it will come with a ferocity and coordination that makes clear this isn't a spontaneous riot. This is something far more calculated, something that will reveal truths about America that many would prefer to keep buried. To understand what happened in Tulsa in 1921, you need to understand that this wasn't one city. It was two cities occupying the same space, separated by railroad tracks and an ocean of hatred. Let me show you both sides of those tracks, because the contrast is everything. Tulsa in 1921 is booming. The population has exploded from 1,400 people in 1900 to over 100,000 by 1920. This isn't gradual growth. This is a stampede, and the reason has one word: oil. In 1901, the first major oil well was drilled near Tulsa. Within a few years, oil derricks dot the landscape around the city. By 1921, Tulsa calls itself the oil capital of the world, and it's not an empty boast. More oil millionaires live in Tulsa than anywhere else in America. South Tulsa, White Tulsa, is a city of extremes. Millionaires build mansions that rival anything in New York or San Francisco. The Southern Hills Country Club caters to oil barons who think nothing of spending thousands of dollars on a single party. Downtown Tulsa has modern office buildings, department stores, hotels with marble lobbies, and crystal chandeliers. The theaters show the latest pictures from Hollywood. The restaurants serve fine dining. This is American capitalism at its most successful, at least for those who are white. But alongside this, wealth is grinding poverty. Oil field workers, many of them recent immigrants or migrants from rural areas, live in tent cities and ramshackle housing. They work brutal hours for low pay while watching millionaires drive past in luxury cars. There's anger in white working-class Tulsa, anger at wealth inequality, anger at changing times, and that anger needs a target. The Ku Klux Klan is growing in Tulsa in 1920 and 1921. Not the Reconstruction-era Klan, but the new Klan that emerged in 1915. This version of the Klan presents itself as a civic organization. They hold parades. They recruit openly. They claim to stand for law and order, for American values, for Protestant Christianity. But underneath the rhetoric, it's the same hatred, the same white supremacy, the same terrorism. Klan membership in Tulsa is widespread. Police officers join, businessmen join, elected officials join. The Klan isn't some fringe organization in 1921 Tulsa. It's mainstream. It's respectable. And it makes no secret of its hatred for Black Americans, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of American. Now, segregation in Tulsa isn't just social custom. It's law. Oklahoma became a state in 1907, and one of the first things the new state government did was implement Jim Crow laws. Separate schools for Black and white children. Separate railroad cars. Separate waiting rooms. Separate water fountains. Separate everything. Interracial marriage is illegal. Black people cannot serve on juries in cases involving white defendants. The law is explicitly designed to enforce white supremacy. But here's where Tulsa's situation becomes uniquely volatile. In most southern cities, Black communities are poor and economically dependent on white businesses. White supremacists can point to Black poverty as proof of racial inferiority. It's a circular logic. We oppress you, then point to the results of oppression as justification for more oppression. Greenwood breaks that cycle. The prosperity visible across the railroad tracks in North Tulsa directly contradicts white supremacist ideology. Black Tulsans aren't just surviving. They're thriving. They own property. They run businesses. They employ people. They drive cars. They send their children to good schools. They accumulate wealth. And they do all of this despite segregation, despite discrimination, despite every obstacle white Tulsa puts in their way. This success drives some white Tulsans absolutely crazy. You can read it in the newspapers. Articles about the Negro problem appear regularly in white Tulsa papers. Editorials complain about black people getting above their station. There are complaints about black men driving nice cars, about black women wearing fine clothes, about black professionals commanding respect. Some white business owners resent Greenwood economically. Why are black Tulsans spending money at black-owned businesses instead of at white businesses? In the twisted logic of segregation, white Tulsans want black money, but don't want black people in their stores. They want black labor, but don't want to pay fair wages. They want black subordination, but are furious when black people create their own parallel economy. White workers, especially poor whites, feel additional resentment. They see black professionals earning more than they do. They see black families living in nicer homes. They see black children attending schools that might actually be better than the underfunded white schools in poor neighborhoods. This contradicts everything they've been taught about racial hierarchy. If black people aren't inherently inferior, then what explains poor whites' lack of success? Better to blame black people for taking what's ours than to confront the reality of class exploitation. Let me give you a specific example of this tension. In 1920, a black man in Tulsa, sources disagree on his name, bought a new car, a nice one. He drove it through downtown Tulsa, completely legal, minding his own business. A white police officer stopped him. The officer couldn't cite him for any violation, so instead he made the black man get out of the car while the officer inspected it, looking for any excuse to issue a citation. Finding nothing, the officer warned the black man that he better be careful driving such a nice car because it might give people the wrong idea. The wrong idea. The idea that black people could be successful. That was threatening. Or consider this. In 1920, there was a minor incident at a business on the border between white and black Tulsa. A white customer and a black customer had a disagreement. Nothing violent, just an argument. The white customer called the police. When police arrived, they arrested only the black customer, even though witnesses said he'd done nothing wrong. When the black man's lawyer, one of Greenwood's attorneys, came to the police station to demand his release, the police threatened to arrest the lawyer too for interfering with police business. These incidents happened regularly. Black Tulsans lived with the constant knowledge that at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all, white authority could come down on them. The only protection was staying in Greenwood, staying north of those tracks, staying in their own world. But even that wasn't really protection, because white Tulsa watched Greenwood with a mixture of fascination, envy, and rage. Some white Tulsans would sneak across the tracks at night to visit Greenwood's jazz clubs, to hear the music they couldn't hear in white venues, to experience the energy and culture they couldn't find in segregated white Tulsa. Then, they'd go back across those tracks and vote for politicians who promised to keep Negroes in their place. The newspapers fed this resentment. The Tulsa Tribune, one of the city's two major daily papers, was particularly inflammatory. Editor Richard Lloyd Jones wasn't shy about his views. He regularly published editorials and articles that portrayed black Tulsans as a threat. He used coded language, crime and disorder, and outside agitators. But everyone knew what he meant. He was telling white Tulsa that black success was dangerous, that black pride was threatening, that something needed to be done. Now, let's add another volatile element. World War I veterans. The United States entered World War I in 1917. Thousands of black men enlisted or were drafted. They served in segregated units under mostly white officers. They faced discrimination even in uniform, but they fought bravely. Black soldiers from Oklahoma served in France, faced German artillery and machine guns, bled and died for democracy abroad. When these veterans returned home in 1919 and 1920, they came back different. They'd worn the uniform. They'd fought for America. They'd been treated better by French civilians than they'd ever been treated in Oklahoma. and they were less willing to tolerate the racism that told them they weren't full Americans. Many black veterans settled in Greenwood, drawn by its prosperity and sense of black pride. These men had combat experience. They knew how to handle weapons. They knew tactics and organization, and they were determined not to bow to white supremacist violence. When they heard stories about lynchings, and there had been several in Oklahoma in recent years, they talked openly about armed self-defense. This talk terrified white Tulsa. The idea of black men, especially armed black men, standing up for themselves challenged the entire racial hierarchy. The summer of 1919, called the Red Summer, saw race riots in more than 25 American cities. White mobs attacked black neighborhoods in Chicago, Washington, D.C., Omaha, and elsewhere. In some cities, black residents fought back. White America was shocked. The subservient, scared black people of white imagination were fighting back, defending themselves, refusing to be victims. Tulsa watched these events nervously. White Tulsans worried that the violence might spread to their city. Black Tulsans saw the riots differently. They saw white mobs attacking black communities and understood that nowhere was safe, that prosperity didn't protect you, that at any moment white supremacy might decide to destroy what black people had built. Then in August 1920, 2 black men, teenagers really, were lynched in Tulsa County. They were accused of killing a white man, though evidence was questionable. A mob took them from the jail and hanged them from a bridge. No one was ever prosecuted for the lynchings. The message was clear. White Tulsa could kill black people with impunity. Black Tulsans were terrified and furious. A.J. Smitherman, editor of the Tulsa Star, wrote a fiery editorial condemning the lynchings and calling for justice. He didn't get justice. What he got was a warning from white authorities to watch his tone or face consequences. The black community understood. Even speaking out against murder could get you killed. So by early 1921, Tulsa is a powder keg. You have white resentment of black success. You have Klan growth and white supremacist organization. You have economic tensions from the oil boom creating wealth inequality. You have returned black veterans who won't quietly accept oppression. You have recent lynchings. You have inflammatory newspaper coverage. You have police and city officials who are either Klan members or sympathetic to Klan ideology. All it needs is a spark. And on May 30th, 1921, that spark comes in the form of a teenage boy, an elevator, and a lie that will destroy everything Greenwood has built. Chapter 5. The Lie That Sparked the Fire. Dick Rowland is 19 years old in May 1921. He's an orphan, raised by his grandmother. He works as a shoe shiner at a shop on Main Street in downtown Tulsa in the white business district. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest work, and Dick is good at it. He's polite, professional, well-liked by his customers. He's never been in trouble with the law. By all accounts, he's a quiet, hard-working young man trying to make a living. Every day, Dick takes the elevator in the Drexel building to the top floor, where the only bathroom that black workers are allowed to use is located. This is Jim Crow in action. Separate bathrooms, and the black bathroom is deliberately placed as far and as inconveniently as possible. The elevator in the Drexel building is operated by Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white girl. She's also working class, probably making barely enough to survive. In normal circumstances, Dick Rowland and Sarah Page have nothing in common except poverty and the need to work. May 30th, 1921 is Memorial Day, a Monday. It's a regular workday. Around mid-morning, Dick Rowland enters the Drexel building and gets on the elevator. Sarah Page is operating it. The elevator starts up. And then something happens. We will never know exactly what, because the two people who were there never gave consistent public accounts. What we do know from later testimony and investigation, Sarah Page screamed. Dick Rowland left the elevator quickly. A clerk on one of the floors heard the scream and saw Rowland leaving. The clerk assumed the worst, that this black man had attacked this white woman. The clerk called the police. What probably actually happened? The most likely explanation, according to later investigators. Dick Rowland tripped entering the elevator. Or the elevator jolted, causing him to stumble and grab Sarah Page's arm to steady himself. She screamed in surprise. He, realizing how this would look, fled. Another theory. They knew each other, possibly were romantically involved, which would be illegal under Oklahoma's anti-miscegenation laws, had some kind of dispute. Page screamed during an argument, and Rowland fled when he realized someone heard. What definitely did not happen: any kind of serious assault. Sarah Page had no torn clothing, no bruises, no injuries of any kind. When police interviewed her later that day, her story was vague and contradictory. She never pressed charges. In fact, the evidence suggests she wanted the whole thing dropped, but by then, it was too late. Dick Rowland fled to Greenwood. He knew the danger he was in. In Oklahoma in 1921, a black man accused of touching a white woman could be lynched, and the legal system would do nothing. He went to his grandmother's house and told her what happened. She must have been terrified. They both knew the history. They both knew what happened to black men accused of assaulting white women. Meanwhile, the police were called. They took statements from the clerk who heard the scream. They examined the elevator and found nothing. No evidence of struggle. No evidence of assault. But they had a black man fleeing the scene and a white woman who screamed. In white Tulsa's mind, that was enough. By afternoon, police had located Dick Rowland in Greenwood. They arrested him and took him to the Tulsa County Courthouse. The courthouse jail was on the top floor, considered the most secure location in Tulsa. Sheriff Willard McCullough was in charge. To his credit, McCullough was one of the few white officials in Tulsa who believed in due process. He'd previously prevented lynchings by protecting prisoners. He was determined to protect Rowland until the case could be properly investigated. But then the Tulsa Tribune got involved. The Tribune's afternoon edition hit the streets around 3 p.m. on May 30th. The front page carried a story about the incident. The headline, and here accounts differ because the Tribune later destroyed all copies of this edition, was something like, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." Some survivors remember a secondary headline or editorial that said, "To lynch Negro tonight." The article itself was inflammatory beyond any responsible journalism. It described Dick Rowland in racist terms. It described an attack on Sarah Page using language that implied sexual assault, despite no evidence of any attack at all. It gave details that were entirely fabricated. And critically, it mentioned that Rowland was being held in the county jail at the courthouse. This was a deliberate decision by the Tribune editors. They knew what mentioning the jail location would do. This wasn't news reporting. This was an invitation to a lynching. Word spread through white Tulsa. By late afternoon, groups of white men were gathering downtown, discussing the incident. The details got more lurid with each retelling. By evening, the story circulating through white Tulsa bore no resemblance to reality. Now it was a violent assault, a brutal attack, a black monster who needed to be dealt with. By 7 p.m., men were heading toward the courthouse. By 8 p.m., a crowd had formed. By 9 p.m., there were an estimated 2,000 white men surrounding the courthouse, many of them armed, and the mood was ugly. This was a lynch mob forming in real time. Sheriff McCullough understood the danger. He positioned his deputies on the roof of the courthouse with rifles. He disabled the elevator so no one could reach the top floor where Rowland was held. He barricaded the stairwell, and he sent word. He would shoot anyone who tried to take his prisoner. McCullough was vastly outnumbered, and he knew it, but he was determined to do his duty. The white mob grew more agitated. Men shouted for Rowland to be handed over. "We'll take care of him," they yelled. "He'll never see trial." Some brought rope, making their intentions clear. Others brought guns. The crowd was feeding on its own energy, getting more aggressive, more violent. Word of the lynch mob reached Greenwood quickly. Black Tulsans had been through this before. They knew what happened when white mobs formed. They knew that sheriffs, even well-meaning ones like McCullough, often buckled under pressure and handed over prisoners to be murdered. They knew that lynch victims were tortured, mutilated, burned, their bodies displayed as warnings. They knew that lynchings were community events for white Southerners, with photographs taken, souvenirs collected, celebrations held. And they knew about the recent lynchings in Tulsa County just months earlier. The memory was fresh. At churches throughout Greenwood, men gathered. These weren't hotheads or criminals. These were business owners, doctors, lawyers, war veterans, respected men, family men. They discussed the situation. Should they go to the courthouse? Should they offer to help the sheriff? Should they defend Dick Rowland? This wasn't an easy decision. Going armed to the courthouse meant confronting white Tulsa directly. It meant risking violence. But doing nothing meant accepting that any black man could be lynched at any time for any accusation, no matter how false. It meant accepting that black life had no value. Around 9 p.m., a group of about 25 armed black men arrived at the courthouse. They were well-dressed, disciplined, clearly military veterans based on how they moved and organized. They approached Sheriff McCullough and offered their services. "We're here to help you protect your prisoner," they said. The white crowd reacted with shock and rage. Black men, armed, at the courthouse, offering to help protect another black man. This violated every assumption white Tulsa had about racial hierarchy. Black people were supposed to be afraid, supposed to beg, supposed to accept whatever white people decided. They weren't supposed to show up armed and organized. Sheriff McCullough, to his credit, tried to defuse the situation. He thanked the black men, but told them he had the situation under control. He asked them to go home. The black men, seeing that the sheriff seemed capable of holding the jail, agreed. They left peacefully. But the white mob didn't disperse. It grew. By 10 p.m., there were an estimated 10,000 white men surrounding the courthouse. 10,000. Let that number sink in. 10,000 armed white men demanding a black prisoner be handed over to be murdered. The black men who had offered to help Sheriff McCullough returned to Greenwood and reported what they'd seen. The size of the white mob was terrifying. If that mob decided to attack Greenwood instead of just trying to lynch Dick Rowland, the community was in serious danger. More men armed themselves. More veterans gathered. Churches became emergency meeting points. Around 10 p.m., a second group of black men, this time about 75, returned to the courthouse. The situation had deteriorated in the hour since the first group left. The white mob was larger, angrier, more organized. Some were clearly drunk. Others were methodical and purposeful. Armed white men were taking positions around the courthouse, as if preparing for an assault. The black men again approached the sheriff, again offered to help defend the jail. Again, McCullough refused and asked them to leave. But this time, the tension was explosive. The white mob pressed closer. Racial slurs were shouted. Threats were made. The black men maintained discipline, but they weren't backing down this time. Then, it happened. A white man approached one of the black veterans, a man identified in later accounts as O.B. Mann. The white man demanded that Mann hand over his weapon. Mann, a World War I veteran, refused. "If you want my gun, come take it," he reportedly said. The white man grabbed for the gun. A struggle ensued. The gun discharged. Whether Mann pulled the trigger deliberately or it went off during the struggle, no one knows for certain. But the shot rang out in the night air like a starting pistol. Chaos erupted. Both sides started shooting. The courthouse square became a battlefield. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. The sound of gunfire echoed off buildings. Men fell, wounded or dead. The initial exchange lasted maybe 2 minutes, but in that time, 12 people died. 10 white, 2 black. The black men, outnumbered more than 100 to 1, retreated in good order toward Greenwood. They moved tactically, covering each other, not running in panic, but conducting a fighting withdrawal. These were trained soldiers using military discipline under fire. The white mob pursued, but half-heartedly at first. They'd expected the black men to flee in terror. Instead, they'd fought back and killed white men. This was shocking. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Black people weren't supposed to shoot white people. The natural order had been violated. But shock turned to rage. The white mob, instead of dispersing, began to organize. And here's where the situation goes from a spontaneous confrontation to something far more sinister. Tulsa police didn't try to break up the mob. Instead, police officers began deputizing white men, giving them badges, giving them legal authority. Get a gun and get a... One officer was heard saying to newly deputized white men. Hardware stores and pawn shops were broken into. Guns and ammunition were looted, with police standing by, watching, or actively participating. By 11 p.m., thousands of white men were armed and being organized into groups. This wasn't a spontaneous mob anymore. This was becoming a military operation. The National Guard was called, but there was confusion about who called them and what their orders were. Some Guard units didn't mobilize until the next morning. Those that did mobilize weren't sent to stop the white mob. They were sent to restore order, which in practice meant helping to round up black Tulsans. Meanwhile, in Greenwood, the community was preparing for the worst. Families barricaded themselves in homes. Veterans took up defensive positions along the railroad tracks and at the southern edge of the neighborhood. They knew white Tulsa was coming. They didn't know when or how, but they knew. Women and children were moved to interior rooms, away from windows. Valuables were gathered, though where could you hide anything that would survive what was coming? Churches stayed open as refuges. Preachers led prayers. Some prayed for peace. Others prayed for strength. A few prayed for God to deliver vengeance on their enemies. Phone calls went out desperately, trying to reach authorities who might help. Calls to the governor's office in Oklahoma City. Calls to federal authorities. Calls to anyone who might send help. But it was Memorial Day night. Offices were closed. And even if calls had gotten through, would help have come? Or would authorities have sided with white Tulsa, as they usually did? As midnight approached, sporadic gunfire could be heard. White men were taking shots at Greenwood from a distance, testing the defenses. Black defenders returned fire, trying to protect the perimeter. Neither side could see much in the darkness, so most shots went wild. But the psychological impact was enormous. Every crack of a rifle was a reminder that violence was coming. Families huddled together. Parents told children to be quiet, to stay down, to not look out windows. Older children understood something terrible was happening. Younger children sensed the fear, even if they didn't understand why. This was supposed to be a safe community. This was supposed to be Black Wall Street, where black families could prosper. Now it felt like a prison, surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead. O.W. Gurley, in his home on Greenwood Avenue, must have looked out at the street he'd developed, the community he'd helped build, and known that by morning it might all be gone. J.B. Stradford, in his hotel, must have calculated the odds and realized his life's work was in jeopardy. Dr. A.C. Jackson, the brilliant surgeon respected, even by white doctors, must have believed that reason would prevail, that his reputation would protect him, that mourning would bring sanity. He would be proven tragically wrong. The Williams family, John and Lula, looked at their dreamland theater, their confectionery, their home, and knew that white mobs had destroyed black prosperity before. They knew about Wilmington. They knew about Rosewood. They knew history, and they knew it was about to repeat. But they also felt defiance. They had built this. They had earned this. This was theirs. And if white Tulsa wanted to take it, black Tulsa would make them pay for it. The veterans manning the defensive positions weren't going to roll over. They'd fought Germans in France. They could fight white supremacists in Oklahoma. As dawn approached on May 31st, 1921, Greenwood waited. The most prosperous black community in America was about to face one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history. Within 24 hours, 35 blocks of black excellence would be reduced to ash and rubble. Up to 300 black Americans would be dead, and the survivors would carry trauma that would last generations. But the residents of Greenwood didn't know that yet. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 31st, they still had hope that the authorities would restore order, that reason would prevail, that justice would be done. They didn't know that the authorities were part of the mob, that reason had fled Tulsa, and that justice would be denied for the next century. The sun was about to rise on Black Wall Street's last day. The sky is just beginning to lighten on May 31st, 1921, when the organized assault on Greenwood begins. The sun isn't up yet, but there's enough light to see. And what the residents of Greenwood see is terrifying. Thousands of white men, armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols, are massing at the borders of their community. This isn't a mob anymore. This is an army. Let me put you in Greenwood at that moment. You're a black veteran, one of the men who returned from the courthouse the night before. You've been awake all night, rifle in hand, watching the southern boundary near the railroad tracks. You've heard sporadic gunfire through the night. You've heard the sounds of the mob organizing. You've seen headlights of cars moving into position. And now, as dawn breaks, you see them clearly for the first time. They're everywhere. Hundreds, maybe thousands, spread out along the railroad tracks. More coming from the west, more from the south. They're moving into position with coordination that suggests planning. Some are in groups of a dozen or more, taking cover behind buildings and vehicles. Others are individuals finding firing positions. Many wear white handkerchiefs or white ribbons on their arms or hats, identification markers so they can tell each other apart from black residents. You look down Greenwood Avenue behind you, your community, the street you've walked 100 times, where you know every business owner, where children play and families gather. In a few minutes, those white men are going to try to destroy it, and there aren't enough defenders to stop them. The black defenders are spread thin along the perimeter. Maybe 100 men, probably fewer, trying to guard multiple blocks. They're mostly veterans, men who know how to fight, but they're outnumbered at least 50 to 1. They have hunting rifles, shotguns, pistols, personal weapons. The white mob has the same, but also has the advantage of numbers, of police support, of knowing that no law will punish them for what they're about to do. The first shots come from the white side around 5 a.m., just as the sun breaks the horizon. Not a single shot, but a volley. Dozens of rifles firing at once. The sound is deafening. Bullets slam into buildings, shatter windows, kick up dirt. The black defenders return fire. For a few minutes, it's a genuine firefight. The white attackers are surprised by the resistance. Some duck for cover. A few are hit. But then the white mob realizes something. The black defenders can't defend everywhere at once. The perimeter is too long, the defenders too few. So the white mob doesn't charge directly into the strongest defensive positions. Instead, they probe for weaknesses, find gaps, start infiltrating into Greenwood from multiple directions. By 5:30 a.m., white attackers have penetrated into Greenwood from the west side. They're moving from house to house, business to business. The black defenders are forced to fall back, fighting a running battle through the streets they're trying to protect. Every retreat means abandoning homes, abandoning families, leaving them to the mercy of men who have no mercy. The police aren't stopping this. The police are participating in it. Uniformed Tulsa police officers are leading groups of white men into Greenwood. They're breaking down doors, dragging black residents out of homes, separating men from women and children. The National Guard troops who have finally arrived aren't stopping the mob either. Some Guard units are actually helping, treating black residents as the enemy, treating the white mob as fellow law enforcement. Let me show you what's happening on specific streets. On Archer Street, one of the main east-west roads through Greenwood, white attackers are moving systematically from building to building. They kick in doors or shoot locks off. They storm into homes where families are hiding. The men are immediately arrested, taken into custody, not for any crime, but simply for being black and being there. The women and children are ordered out of their homes. Then, the looting begins. Before buildings are burned, they're ransacked. White men carry out furniture, clothing, valuables, anything they can grab. Some have trucks waiting to haul away the stolen goods. This isn't spontaneous rioting. This is organized theft. Photos taken that morning, photos that will later be suppressed, show white men posing with their loot, smiling as if they're on a shopping trip. A black family on Archer Street, let's call them the Johnsons, though I'm using that name to protect their identity since descendants still live in Tulsa, experiences the invasion like this. They're huddled in their home, father standing by the door with a shotgun. mother and 3 children in the back bedroom. They hear the gunfire getting closer. They hear shouting, glass breaking, the sounds of destruction moving down their street like a wave. Then their door splinters under the impact of a boot. White men pour in. The father drops his shotgun immediately, hands up. "Don't shoot! We're not resisting." But it doesn't matter. The white men beat him anyway, rifle butts to his face and body until he's on the ground bleeding. They drag him outside. His wife screams, tries to follow, but is shoved back. The children are crying. White men are going through their home now, grabbing anything valuable. The piano the mother saved for years to buy. White men are trying to figure out how to move it. The father's good suit, a white man is holding it up, checking the size. "This'll fit me fine," he says, as if he's at a department store. Then someone produces a torch. The house is going to be burned. The mother and children are ordered out. They stumble into the street, and the mother sees their neighborhood. Multiple houses are already burning. Smoke is rising from buildings up and down the street. Black residents are being marched at gunpoint toward detention points. Bodies lie in the street. People who resisted or who were simply shot because the white attackers could. This scene is repeated across Greenwood. Not just once, not just a few times, but hundreds of times. Every family has a version of this story. Some worse, because some families don't all survive. The black defenders are fighting back wherever they can, but they're being overwhelmed. Small groups of veterans are making stands at street corners, firing at the advancing white mob, then retreating when the position becomes untenable. They're trying to buy time, trying to allow families to escape, trying to maintain some kind of organized resistance, but it's hopeless. There are just too many attackers coming from too many directions. By 6 a.m., barely an hour after the assault began, white attackers control the southern third of Greenwood. Homes are burning. Businesses are looted and torched. Black residents are being rounded up, and the invaders are pushing deeper into the community. Now, throughout this, there's something else happening. Something that eyewitnesses report, but that many later historians initially doubted because it seemed too horrible, too organized, too much like something from a war rather than a domestic incident. Private airplanes are taking off from local airfields and flying over Greenwood. The first plane appears over Greenwood around 6 a.m. It's a small aircraft, the kind used for crop dusting or giving rich people joyrides. It circles low over the neighborhood, maybe 500 feet up. Some black residents actually wave at it initially, thinking maybe it's someone trying to observe what's happening, maybe even trying to help. Then something falls from the plane, and something explodes. Multiple eyewitnesses, survivors whose testimony was recorded decades later, describe seeing planes drop incendiary devices on Greenwood. These weren't bombs in the military sense. These were more likely turpentine-filled bottles with burning rags, or dynamite, or other improvised incendiaries. But the effect was the same. Buildings that weren't yet burning suddenly burst into flames from the roof down. Mary E. Jones Parrish, a survivor who would write one of the first comprehensive accounts of the massacre, described it this way. "We saw planes circling in midair. They grew in number and hummed, darted, and dipped low. I could hear something like hail falling upon the top of my office building. Down East Archer, I saw the old Midway Hotel on fire, burning from its top, and then another and another and another building began to burn from their top." Notice what she says. Buildings burning from the top. Fire normally starts at ground level and rises, but multiple buildings across Greenwood suddenly had fires starting on their roofs. Insurance adjusters who later surveyed the damage noted this unusual pattern. They concluded that aerial attack was the most likely explanation, though their reports were suppressed or ignored. B.C. Franklin was a black attorney in Greenwood who survived the massacre. He wrote, "Aeroplanes were used to drop turpentine balls on the Negro residences." Franklin's account was dismissed by many white historians for decades, but he wasn't the only witness. Dozens of survivors reported the same thing: planes dropping incendiaries. Dr. R.T. Bridgewater, another survivor, gave testimony that planes were dropping nitroglycerin bombs. Whether it was actually nitroglycerin or other incendiaries doesn't change the fundamental fact. Private aircraft were weaponized against American civilians on American soil. Let me be clear about what this means. This was one of the first aerial bombardments of a civilian population in American history. The technology to do this had existed for only a few years. World War I had ended just 3 years earlier. The idea of using planes as weapons against ground targets was still relatively new. And here, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, white attackers were using this technology against black Americans. Who flew the planes? We don't know for certain because no one was ever prosecuted, but Tulsa had several small airfields in 1921. Rich men owned private planes. The oil boom had made aviation increasingly common in Tulsa. Multiple men in Tulsa knew how to fly, and at least some of them volunteered their aircraft for this attack. Imagine being on the ground in Greenwood as this is happening. You're already dealing with white mobs attacking from the ground. You're already watching your neighborhood burn, watching neighbors being beaten or killed, watching your world collapse. And now there are planes overhead, dropping fire from the sky. There's no defense against that. You can't shoot at planes with hunting rifles. You can't hide from incendiaries that start fires from above. You can only run, and that's exactly what thousands of Greenwood residents are now doing. Running, fleeing north, away from the advancing white mob, trying to escape the gunfire and the flames. Families grab whatever they can carry, sometimes children, sometimes a few possessions, sometimes nothing at all, and run. The streets are chaos. People screaming, crying, looking for family members. Children separated from parents in the panic. Elderly residents who can't move fast enough left behind. The fires are spreading rapidly. Greenwood's buildings are mostly wood frame construction. Once one building catches fire, the wind carries embers to the next. By 7 a.m., multiple blocks are fully engulfed. The smoke is thick, black, rising in massive columns visible from miles away. The heat is intense. The sound is overwhelming. The roar of flames, the crack of burning wood, the crash of collapsing buildings, all overlaid with constant gunfire. The white attackers are working systematically. They're not just burning randomly. They're targeting the most important buildings. Churches are set on fire. Schools are torched. The Stradford Hotel, that magnificent 54-room symbol of black success, is looted first, then burned. The Dreamland Theater, where so many community gatherings happened, where children watched their first movies, where couples courted, burned. The Tulsa Star newspaper office, a J. Smitherman's voice for the community, destroyed. Business after business goes up in flames. Mann Brothers Grocery, burned. Williams Confectionery, looted and burned. Dr. Jackson's medical office, destroyed along with all his equipment and patient records. Law offices with their files and records, gone. The Greenwood State Bank, broken into, money stolen, then burned. By 8 a.m., the destruction is nearly complete in the southern half of Greenwood. What took years to build is destroyed in hours. The wealth accumulated through hard work and community support is stolen or turned to ash. And still the white mob pushes forward, burning and looting as they go. But we need to talk about the human cost. Because the destroyed buildings, as terrible as that is, isn't the worst part. The worst part is what happened to the people. Not everyone who stayed in their home was arrested. Some were murdered. The exact number will never be known, but it was substantial. Bodies were found in burned out buildings. Bodies were found in the streets. Bodies were found in yards, in alleys, in places where people tried to hide, and many bodies were never found at all because they were taken and disposed of. Let me tell you about Dr. A.C. Jackson, because his death encapsulates the injustice of what happened. Remember, he was called the most able Negro surgeon in America by the Mayo brothers. He was respected even by white Tulsa's medical establishment. He had white colleagues, white friends. When the violence started, some of his white acquaintances sent word that he would be protected, that he should just stay in his home and wait for things to calm down. Dr. Jackson believed them. He had faith in American justice, faith in law and order, faith that his reputation and skill would protect him. So when the white mob came to his house on the morning of May 31st, He didn't resist. He walked out with his hands raised. "I'm Dr. Jackson," he told them. "I'm not armed. I'm surrendering." They shot him anyway. Multiple witnesses saw it happen. Dr. Jackson was standing in his yard, hands up, no weapon, no threat, telling them who he was. And they shot him in the back. He fell, mortally wounded. His wife ran to him. The white men wouldn't let her help him. They made her stand back while he bled out in his own yard. One of the finest surgeons in Oklahoma, a man who had saved countless lives, died in the dirt outside his home while his killer stood over him. Why? Why kill a man who was surrendering? Because this wasn't about self-defense or stopping a riot. This was about terror. This was about sending a message. No level of education, no amount of success, no professional reputation would protect you if you were black. The most successful, the most respected, the most respectable by white standards, none of it mattered. You were still just a target. Dr. Jackson's murder was witnessed by multiple people. Everyone knew who did it. No one was ever charged. His widow eventually left Tulsa. What else could she do? Stay in a city that murdered her husband and called it justice? But Dr. Jackson's story, though tragic, at least is known. He was famous enough that his death was recorded. What about all the others? What about the families whose names we don't know? There was an elderly couple, survivors later testified about this, who were too old to evacuate. They stayed in their home when the white mob came through their neighborhood. White men kicked in their door, beat the elderly man, then set the house on fire with both of them still inside. Neighbors trying to help were driven back by gunfire. The couple burned to death in their home of many years. There were teenagers, boys really, who were shot while trying to defend their families. There were mothers killed while trying to protect their children. There were babies who died from smoke inhalation when buildings were set on fire. There were people with disabilities who couldn't evacuate and were left to die in the flames. And there were executions. Not heated violence, not killing in the moment, but cold-blooded murder. Black men who had already surrendered were taken to alleys or vacant lots and shot. Their bodies were left where they fell, or in some cases, thrown into the Arkansas River, or buried in mass graves. One survivor, a young man at the time, testified decades later about seeing white men line up a group of black men against a wall and shoot them, just execute them. No trial, no charges, no anything. Just murder. When asked why no one reported it to authorities at the time, he laughed bitterly. The authorities were doing the shooting, he said. Women and children weren't immune either. While white men focused on killing black men, women were beaten, assaulted, terrorized. Some women were sexually assaulted. Testimony about this came out decades later from survivors who were finally willing to speak about it. Children watched their fathers beaten or killed. The psychological trauma was immeasurable. Let me walk you through what happened to specific families based on survivor testimony. The Mann family. O.B. Mann was the veteran who had been at the courthouse the night before. He returned to Greenwood and tried to defend his family's home. He exchanged gunfire with white attackers until he ran out of ammunition. Then he fled with his wife and children through the railway cut, a depression where railroad tracks ran. They hid in tall grass while white men searched for them, occasionally firing into the grass, hoping to hit anyone hiding there. The Mann family survived, but O.B. Mann's parents, who lived in a different house, were both killed. He never saw their bodies. They were simply gone, lost in the chaos. The Goody family. Carly Goody was 8 months pregnant. When white men came to their house, Carly and her husband Calvin tried to hide in the attic. The white men set the house on fire. Calvin had to break through the roof to escape, then help Carly down while the house burned. They lost everything. Carly went into premature labor days later. The baby survived, but Carly was never the same. She had nightmares for the rest of her life about being trapped in that burning attic. The Williams family, John and Lula Williams, watched the Dreamland Theater burn. Everything they'd built, their community's gathering place, gone in minutes. They evacuated with only the clothes on their backs. The confectionery where they'd served ice cream to generations of children, destroyed. Their home looted and burned. Years of work erased in hours. John Williams would later write, "I stood watching the most substantial of my earthly possessions go up in smoke, and nothing I could do but watch." Mount Zion Baptist Church, one of the largest and most beautiful churches in Greenwood, was burned to the ground. The church had been built with donations from the entire community, with people giving what they could afford, with volunteer labor from members. It represented faith and community and sacrifice. The white mob burned it like it was nothing. First Baptist Church, same fate. Every church in Greenwood was destroyed. Every single one. Booker T. Washington High School, where so many black children got the education that was supposed to lead to better lives, was thoroughly destroyed. The library, the science labs, the classrooms, all of it burned or damaged beyond repair. The message was clear. White Tulsa didn't want black children educated. By 9 a.m. on May 31st, most of Greenwood south of the Frisco tracks was burning or already burned. The white mob continued pushing north, destroying everything in its path. Black residents who hadn't evacuated yet were now desperate to escape. The roads north out of Greenwood were packed with refugees, people carrying children, dragging suitcases, helping elderly relatives, all fleeing for their lives. Some white Tulsans, to be fair, tried to help. There are accounts of white families hiding black neighbors, of white people giving black refugees rides out of the danger zone, of white citizens trying to stop the violence. But they were a small minority, and they risked being attacked themselves if the mob saw them helping black people. The vast majority of white Tulsa either participated in the attack or watched it happen without intervening. Some treated it like entertainment, driving to the edges of Greenwood to watch the neighborhood burn. Photos show white people posing in front of burning buildings, smiling for the camera, as if they're at a spectacle rather than witnessing mass murder and destruction. By 10 a.m., the organized resistance by black defenders had completely collapsed. There was no perimeter anymore, no defensive line. It was just survival. Every man for himself, every family running, everyone trying to escape. The defenders who had fought so bravely through the morning were now trying to save their own families, to help as many people evacuate as possible. The white mob, meeting less resistance, became more brazen. They weren't just burning buildings anymore. They were destroying them systematically. Dynamite was used to demolish structures that weren't burning fast enough. The goal seemed to be to ensure that nothing could be salvaged, that rebuilding would be impossible. The smoke from Greenwood was visible from miles away. People in other Oklahoma cities could see it. Train passengers passing through Tulsa saw the smoke and wondered what was burning. Within Tulsa, white residents downtown could see the massive columns of black smoke rising from North Tulsa. They knew what was happening, and most of them approved. By noon on May 31st, approximately 18 hours after the initial confrontation at the courthouse, Greenwood was gone. 35 blocks, more than 1,200 homes, over 300 businesses, every church, every school, every community institution, destroyed. The most prosperous black community in America had been reduced to smoking ruins in less than a day. But the violence wasn't over. Now came the roundup, the arrests, the detention of the survivors, because white Tulsa wasn't satisfied with just destroying Black Wall Street. They wanted to punish the survivors for daring to defend themselves, for daring to build something in the first place, for daring to be successful while black. The final toll would take weeks or months to calculate, and even then it would be deliberately undercounted. Official reports would claim 36 deaths, a number so obviously false that even white Tulsans knew it was a lie. The real number was never determined with certainty. Mass graves were dug and filled. Bodies were thrown in the river. Some people simply disappeared and were never accounted for. Estimates from the black community ranged from 100 to 300 dead, with 300 being the most common estimate from survivors. Modern historians generally accept a range of 100 to 300 killed, acknowledging that the true number will never be known. For comparison, 36 people died in the famous OK Corral shootout. Except that didn't happen. That's a myth. 36 people might have died in the first hour of the Tulsa Massacre. By the time it was over, the death toll was orders of magnitude higher. 10,000 people were left homeless, an entire community displaced, families torn apart, generational wealth destroyed, dreams burned to ash, and the survivors were about to discover that the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning a new phase. Because now they would be treated as the criminals, rounded up like prisoners of war, while those who murdered and burned and looted walked free. The survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand how America could allow this to happen. How could police participate in mass murder? How could the National Guard help destroy rather than protect? How could private citizens bomb their neighbors from the air? How could a city destroy itself and then pretend it didn't happen? These questions would haunt them. The trauma would mark them. And when they tried to tell their stories, they would be silenced, threatened, told to forget. America wanted to forget. White Tulsa wanted to move on. The story of Black Wall Street was meant to disappear completely, as if it never existed. But the survivors remembered. They carried the memory like a weight. And decades later, when they were finally allowed to speak, they told the truth about the prosperity that was destroyed, about the violence that destroyed it, about the injustice that followed, and about how America forgot it all, because remembering would mean confronting truths too painful to bear. By early afternoon on May 31st, the burning has mostly stopped. Not because the white mob showed mercy, but because there's nothing left to burn in Greenwood. 35 blocks of ash and rubble, smoke still rising from the ruins. And now begins a new phase of the nightmare, the mass arrest and detention of the survivors. Imagine you've just survived the worst day of your life. Your home is gone. Your business is destroyed. Maybe you've seen family members killed. You've been running for hours, terrified, traumatized. You're exhausted, in shock, possibly injured. You're standing somewhere north of what used to be your neighborhood, trying to figure out what to do next, where to go, how to survive, and then armed men approach you. Not to help, to arrest you. That's what happened to thousands of Black Tulsans on May 31st and June 1st. National Guard troops and police, backed by armed white civilians who'd been deputized during the attack, began systematically rounding up every black person they could find. Men, women, children, elderly, infants, everyone. If you were black and in or near Tulsa, you were arrested. The official justification was protective custody. The authorities claimed they were protecting black residents from the mob, but that made no sense. The mob had just spent hours attacking black residents with police help. The police had deputized the mob. The National Guard had assisted in the destruction. And now, suddenly, these same authorities claimed they were protecting the victims? No, this was something else. This was about control, punishment, and covering up what had just happened. The roundup was methodical. Troops swept through what remained of Greenwood and the areas where survivors had fled. Black residents were ordered at gunpoint to march to detention centers. No explanations, no charges, no warrants, just orders. Get moving. Now. Anyone who hesitated or questioned was threatened or beaten. Families were separated during the march. Men were sent to one detention center, women and children to another. Parents desperately tried to keep track of their children in the chaos. Elderly residents struggled to keep up with the forced march. Some collapsed and were dragged or carried by other detainees. The guards showed no sympathy. Move faster. Stay in line. Shut up. The main detention center was the convention hall in downtown Tulsa. This was a large building used for exhibitions and public events. Now, it became a prison camp holding thousands of Black Tulsans. McNulty Baseball Park was another major detention site, an outdoor stadium where people were held in the open with no shelter. The fairgrounds also served as a detention center. By the evening of May 31st, an estimated 6,000 Black Tulsans were in detention. By June 1st, That number had grown to nearly 10,000, essentially the entire black population of Tulsa. Think about that. An entire community imprisoned without charges, held at gunpoint for the crime of being black in Tulsa during a white riot. Let me describe the conditions. At Convention Hall, thousands of people were packed into a space meant for hundreds. There was no food initially, no water, no sanitation. People sat or stood, pressed together, in the June heat. The smell became overwhelming. Thousands of unwashed bodies, no toilets, no ventilation. Children cried. Adults tried to comfort them, but had nothing to offer. No food, no water, no answers to the question every child asked, when can we go home? At McNulty Baseball Park, the conditions were even worse. This was an outdoor facility. The June Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly. There was some water, a few spigots that guards grudgingly allowed people to access, but nothing like enough for thousands of people. No shade. People took off clothes to create makeshift shelters for children and elderly. Guards with rifles surrounded the perimeter. Anyone who approached the fence was threatened. The fairgrounds detention was similar. Outdoor pens, minimal facilities, armed guards. Families huddled together when they could, but many had been separated. Mothers frantically searched for children. Children wandered looking for parents. Elderly residents, some of whom had medical conditions, began to deteriorate. And the guards did nothing to help. This was punishment, not protection. After the first day, some food appeared. White churches and the Red Cross provided minimal rations, bread, water, occasionally soup. But it wasn't nearly enough. People were hungry, thirsty, exhausted. Some were injured from the attack and received no medical attention. A few died in detention from untreated injuries or heat exposure or stress. Those deaths were never officially recorded. The psychological torture was as bad as the physical conditions. The survivors had just watched their community destroyed. They'd seen loved ones killed. They'd lost everything they owned. And now they were being treated like criminals, held without charges, with no idea when or if they'd be released. The trauma compounded on trauma. But here's where it gets even more sinister. While black Tulsans were detained, white Tulsans were looting what remained of Greenwood. Remember, the buildings had been burned, but not everything was destroyed. Safes were blown open and emptied. Anything metal or valuable that survived the fires was taken. Jewelry, silverware, tools, anything. Trucks and cars were driven into the ruins to haul away salvageable goods. The detention served multiple purposes. Obviously, it removed witnesses from the crime scene. With black residents imprisoned, white Tulsans could move freely through Greenwood's ruins, taking whatever they wanted. But it also established a power dynamic. Black Tulsans were being told, "You have no rights. We can imprison you without cause. We can hold you indefinitely. Your only chance of release is our mercy." And that mercy came with conditions. To be released from detention, a black Tulsan needed a green card. This was a card signed by a white employer or a responsible white citizen vouching for the black person. Without this card, you stayed in detention indefinitely. The system was designed to force black Tulsans into dependency on white Tulsans. Think about what this meant. Your home was destroyed by white Tulsans. You were imprisoned by white authorities. And now, your freedom depended on a white person agreeing to vouch for you. Many white employers took advantage. They offered to sign green cards only if black workers agreed to low wages, long hours, or other exploitative conditions. What choice did people have? Stay in detention or accept whatever terms were offered. Some black Tulsans had no connection to white employers and no white acquaintances willing to vouch for them. They stayed in detention for days, sometimes weeks. Families were kept apart. Children were held with their mothers, but separated from fathers. The psychological damage was immeasurable. Even those who were released faced immediate problems. Released to where? Their homes were gone. Their possessions were destroyed. They had no money. It had all been lost or stolen. Many families had no choice but to leave Tulsa entirely. Others ended up in tent cities that the Red Cross established on the outskirts of where Greenwood had been. The Red Cross, to their credit, tried to help. They provided tents, some food, basic supplies, but they were overwhelmed. Thousands of homeless people with nothing. The Red Cross couldn't rebuild homes. They couldn't restore businesses. They couldn't bring back the dead. They could only provide minimal humanitarian aid to keep people alive. By mid-June, most Black Tulsans had been released from detention, though a few were held longer on various pretexts. But release didn't mean freedom. It meant being forced to live in tents in the ruins of your community, under the watchful eyes of the same authorities who had helped destroy it. It meant starting over with absolutely nothing. It meant living with trauma and fear and rage that had nowhere to go. And as if all this wasn't enough, the authorities in White Tulsa began rewriting history in real time, creating a narrative that would dominate for decades, a narrative that blamed the victims for their own destruction. In the first hours and days after the massacre, some truthful reporting occurred. The Tulsa Tribune and the Tulsa World, the city's two main newspapers, initially described the events with some accuracy. They reported that white mobs had attacked Greenwood. They described the destruction. Some early accounts even acknowledged that Black Tulsans had been defending themselves and their property. But very quickly, the narrative began to shift. By June 2nd, just 2 days after the massacre began, newspaper articles were starting to use different language. It was no longer an attack on Greenwood. It was a race riot. The implication being that both sides were equally responsible, that this was chaotic violence rather than organized destruction. Then the language shifted further. It became a Negro uprising. Stories began emphasizing the confrontation at the courthouse, presenting it as black aggression against white authorities. The context, that a lynch mob of 10,000 white men had gathered to murder a black teenager based on a false accusation, was minimized or omitted entirely. Dick Rowland's alleged assault on Sarah Page was reported as fact, even though no evidence supported it, and Sarah Page herself refused to press charges. White Tulsa needed a narrative that justified what had happened. They couldn't say, "We destroyed a prosperous black community because we were jealous and racist." They needed a story where white Tulsans were defending themselves, where black Tulsans were dangerous aggressors, where the destruction of Greenwood was regrettable but necessary. So that's the story they created. The Tulsa County Grand Jury convened on June 8th to investigate the events. Notice the speed, just 8 days after the massacre. Compare that to the decades it would take to conduct a thorough investigation. The grand jury was composed entirely of white men. No black Tulsans were allowed to serve. The proceedings were not open to the public. The grand jury's report, issued on June 25th, was a masterclass in victim blaming. The report concluded that the riot was caused by certain bad Negroes. It specifically blamed black Tulsans for going to the courthouse armed, calling this act the direct cause of all that followed. The report praised the white citizens who responded to the call of duty to stop the uprising. Read that again. The grand jury praised the white mob that destroyed Greenwood. The people who murdered, burned, and looted were described as responding to the call of duty. The black Tulsans who tried to defend themselves and their community were blamed for causing the violence. The report recommended that several black community leaders be prosecuted for inciting the riot. A.J. Smitherman, the newspaper editor who had written against lynching, was indicted. J.B. Stradford, the hotel owner, was indicted. Other prominent black Tulsans were targeted for prosecution. The message was clear. Black leadership, black pride, black success, all of it was dangerous and would be punished. Dick Rowland, whose alleged assault started everything, was quietly released. Sarah Page refused to testify against him. The prosecutor, realizing there was no evidence and that a trial would expose the lie that justified the massacre, dropped the charges. Rowland left Tulsa and never returned. Sarah Page also disappeared from public record. Neither of them wanted any part of the story that had destroyed an entire community. Meanwhile, not a single white person was indicted for the violence. Not one. Despite thousands of witnesses. Despite photographs showing white men with guns and looted goods. despite known murders, arson, and theft. 0 prosecutions. The legal system had decided that destroying Black Wall Street was not a crime. A J. Smitherman, facing indictment and death threats, fled Oklahoma. He eventually settled in Massachusetts, where he continued his journalism career. J.B. Stradford also fled, first to Kansas and then to Chicago. He died in 1935, never returning to Tulsa. His criminal record from the 1921 indictment wasn't cleared until 1996, 75 years later, long after his death. Other black leaders left Oklahoma, taking their talents and wealth to other states. Brain drain on a massive scale. Now let's talk about the insurance situation, because this is where the economic destruction became permanent. Black Tulsans had insurance on their homes and businesses. They'd been responsible property owners, paying premiums, following the rules. When their properties were destroyed, they filed claims. Every single claim was denied. The insurance companies pointed to clauses in policies that excluded coverage for riot or insurrection. Since the grand jury had declared this a riot, the exclusions applied. Never mind that it wasn't a riot in any meaningful sense. It was an organized attack with government participation. Never mind that black property owners had paid premiums specifically for protection against loss. The insurance companies refused to pay a single dollar. Black Tulsans sued. The cases went to Oklahoma courts. The courts sided with the insurance companies. Every time. The legal reasoning was circular. It was declared a riot. Policies exclude riots, therefore no coverage. The fact that calling it a riot was itself part of the cover-up didn't matter to the courts. The message was clear. The system would not help black Tulsans recover. Think about what this meant economically. The estimated property damage was $1.5 to $2 million in 1921 dollars, roughly $27 to $35 million today. That's the immediate loss. But insurance exists precisely to help people rebuild after disasters. Without insurance payouts, most black Tulsans had no capital to rebuild. They'd lost everything and had no way to recover. Some families left Tulsa for good, joining the Great Migration to northern cities, where they hoped for better treatment. Others stayed but could only afford to rebuild modest homes, nothing like what they'd lost. The businesses that had made Greenwood prosperous? Most never reopened. The doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs. Many left for cities where their work wouldn't be destroyed overnight. The city of Tulsa offered no compensation, no relief fund, no rebuilding assistance, nothing. In fact, the city did the opposite. Within weeks of the massacre, the Tulsa City Commission passed a new fire code requiring that any buildings in the burned district be constructed with fire-resistant materials, brick or concrete rather than wood. This sounds reasonable until you realize the cost. Building with fire-resistant materials was far more expensive. Most black Tulsans who'd lost everything couldn't afford it. This was a deliberate attempt to prevent Greenwood from being rebuilt. If black Tulsans couldn't afford to rebuild to code, their land could be seized or purchased cheaply by white developers. Some white Tulsans saw this as an opportunity. Prime real estate near downtown suddenly available. Black property owners sued to block the fire code, arguing it was discriminatory and designed to force them out. In one of the few legal victories, the Oklahoma Supreme Court struck down the fire code in 1922. But by then, the damage was done. Many black families had already sold their property at fire sale prices, convinced they could never rebuild. Those who did rebuild faced enormous challenges. They had to secure loans without insurance money. They had to rebuild while living in tents. They had to do all this while traumatized, while mourning loved ones, while under constant surveillance and threat from white authorities. That anyone rebuilt at all is a testament to incredible resilience. But Greenwood would never recover its former prosperity. The economic ecosystem that made Black Wall Street special, the density of businesses, the circulation of money within the community, the wealth accumulation, was broken. You can't just rebuild that. It takes decades to develop, and it was destroyed in hours. As weeks turned to months, something even more insidious than the massacre itself began happening. the systematic erasure of evidence that it had occurred at all. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate policy by Tulsa's white establishment to ensure that what happened in May 1921 would be forgotten. Start with the newspaper archives. The Tulsa Tribune's May 30th, 1921 afternoon edition, the one with the inflammatory headline about Dick Rowland, disappeared. Not just individual copies, but from archives, from libraries, from the microfilm records. Years later, when historians tried to research what that headline actually said, they found nothing. The newspaper claimed the records were lost or damaged, but specific records from specific days don't just disappear unless someone wants them to. Other newspaper archives were selectively edited. Articles that described white violence too explicitly were removed from bound volumes. Photographs were taken from files. The Tulsa World's archive for June 1921 is incomplete, with key pages missing. The official explanation is always the same: lost, damaged, misplaced. But the pattern is too consistent to be accidental. Police records from May and June 1921 are suspiciously thin. Given that thousands of people were arrested, you'd expect extensive documentation. Instead, there are only fragmentary records. Arrest reports are missing. Incident reports don't exist. The detective division's files for this period are gone. Fire department records are incomplete, strange for an event where hundreds of buildings burned. You'd expect detailed reports about the fires, their causes, their spread. Instead, there's almost nothing. Hospital records disappeared too. Multiple people were treated for gunshot wounds, burns, injuries. Where are the admission records? Where are the treatment notes? Gone. Death certificates were never issued for most victims. How can hundreds of people die and leave no official record of their deaths? Because someone made sure there were no records. Court records survived better because they were harder to destroy, but even these were selectively preserved. Records of insurance cases that black Tulsans lost, those survived. Records of the grand jury blaming black Tulsans, those survived. But records that might have shown white culpability? Mysteriously incomplete. Then there's the issue of the bodies. In the immediate aftermath, survivors reported seeing mass graves being dug. Multiple witnesses described trucks carrying bodies, sometimes stacked like cordwood. Some bodies were reportedly dumped in the Arkansas River, weighted down, or just thrown in to be carried away by the current. Others were buried in unmarked graves. In 1999, when the Oklahoma legislature finally authorized an investigation into the massacre, survivors testified about mass graves. They named specific locations: Oak Lawn Cemetery, New Block Park, an area near the Arkansas River. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed anomalies consistent with mass graves at several sites. But here's the thing: for 78 years, authorities denied these graves existed. They called survivor testimony unreliable. They said it was all rumor and exaggeration. Why would authorities spend decades denying what survivors insisted was true? Because admitting mass graves exist means admitting the scale of murder. The official death toll from 1921 was 36 people, 10 white, 26 black. This number is absurdly low. Everyone knew it was absurd even in 1921. But it was the official number, and authorities stuck to it for decades. If you dig up mass graves and find hundreds of bodies, you can't maintain the fiction that only 36 people died. You have to acknowledge that the death toll was far higher. And if the death toll was far higher, then this wasn't a riot with some unfortunate casualties. This was a massacre. This was mass murder. That's a truth white Tulsa didn't want to face. Photographs of the massacre exist, but they nearly didn't. Many photos were taken during the destruction. White Tulsans photographed themselves posing with guns, standing in front of burning buildings, holding looted goods. These weren't hidden snapshots. These were people proud of what they'd done, documenting it like a hunting trip. In the days after the massacre, police and National Guard troops confiscated cameras from black residents and destroyed the film. White people's photos were also confiscated in some cases, supposedly as evidence, but then the photos disappeared into police custody and were never seen again. The official reason was protecting people's privacy. The real reason was destroying evidence. A few photographs survived because people hid them. Some white Tulsans kept photos as souvenirs, and their descendants later donated them to archives. Some black survivors hid photos despite the risk. These surviving images are powerful evidence of what happened. They show the scale of destruction, the military-style organization of the attack, the casual cruelty of the perpetrators. But for decades, these photos weren't published. They weren't shown in schools. They weren't part of the historical record accessible to most people. The visual evidence of the massacre was suppressed almost as thoroughly as the written evidence. Now, why go to all this effort to erase evidence? Because Tulsa's white leadership understood that what happened was indefensible. If the full truth came out, there might be federal intervention. There might be prosecutions. There might be compensation required. There would certainly be national embarrassment. Better to cover it up. Better to destroy records, suppress photos, deny the mass graves, threaten survivors into silence. Better to create a narrative of a race riot where both sides were at fault, where the destruction was regrettable, but understandable, where the best thing to do is move on and never speak of it again. And this strategy worked. Incredibly, it worked. By the 1930s, many white Tulsans claimed not to know what happened in 1921. Oh, they knew something had happened. You can't destroy 35 blocks of a city and have people not notice. But the details became fuzzy. The official story was vague, and anyone who pressed for details was told it wasn't appropriate to discuss. Black survivors knew the truth, obviously. They'd lived it, but they were terrorized into silence. Survivors who tried to talk about the massacre received visits from police or anonymous threats. If you keep talking about this, we'll finish what we started. That's not a veiled threat. That's a promise of murder. So survivors learned to stay quiet. Some told their children what happened, but often in whispers, as stories not to be repeated outside the family. Other survivors never told their children at all, afraid that even passing on the story might bring danger. The trauma was buried, internalized, carried silently. White Tulsans maintained a gentleman's agreement never to discuss 1921. If it came up, you changed the subject. You didn't talk about it in polite company. You certainly didn't teach it in schools. Tulsa's history books made no mention of the massacre. Oklahoma's state history curriculum ignored it entirely. By the 1950s, young people growing up in Tulsa, both black and white, often didn't know it had happened. This is how history gets erased. Not all at once, but gradually. Destroy the records, suppress the photos, threaten the survivors. Don't teach it in schools. Wait for people to die. And eventually, the crime is forgotten. Except it wasn't completely forgotten. Black Tulsa remembered, even if they couldn't speak openly. The empty lots where businesses used to stand were reminders. The families who left and never returned were reminders. The trauma passed down through generations was a reminder. You don't forget something like this, even if you're not allowed to talk about it. And some people refuse to stay silent. Some survivors, particularly as they got older and felt they had less to lose, began telling their stories. In the 1970s and 1980s, a few historians, both black and white, began researching what happened. They interviewed survivors. They found the hidden photographs. They discovered that the official story was a lie. But it would take until the 1990s, more than 70 years after the massacre, for Oklahoma to officially acknowledge what happened. It would take until 2001 for a comprehensive state report to be issued, and it would take until 2020, nearly 100 years later, for serious efforts to locate and excavate the mass graves. A century of silence, a century of denial, a century of survivors and their descendants living with trauma while the world pretended nothing had happened. That's the true crime of the cover-up. Not just that it protected the perpetrators, though it did, but that it denied the victims justice, denied the survivors recognition, denied the descendants closure. The massacre destroyed Black Wall Street in 1921. The cover-up ensured it would stay destroyed, because how do you rebuild when history pretends you never existed in the first place? How do you mourn when your dead don't even have graves? How do you heal when you're not allowed to speak about your wounds? These are the questions that survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Questions without good answers. Questions that their children and grandchildren would inherit. Questions that America still struggles to answer today. June 1921. The smoke has cleared from what used to be Greenwood. Now you can see the full extent of the devastation. Block after block of rubble and ash. Brick chimneys standing like tombstones, the only things left of burned homes. Twisted metal where businesses once stood. The streets are empty except for people picking through ruins, looking for anything salvageable. There's almost nothing to find. Imagine being a survivor returning to where your home once stood. You walk streets you've walked 1,000 times, but nothing looks familiar. That corner where the Williams confectionery used to be? Just a foundation and ash. The Stradford Hotel, that magnificent 3-story building? Collapsed walls and burned timbers. Your own home? You find the lot by counting from the corner, because there are no landmarks left. And where your house stood, there's nothing but a concrete foundation and the charred remains of your life. You sift through the ash with your hands, hoping to find something, anything. Maybe your mother's jewelry survived the fire, maybe the iron skillet, maybe some tool from your husband's workshop. You find pieces of melted glass, bent nails, the metal frame of a bed, warped by heat. That's all. Everything else, the furniture you saved for, the clothes you carefully maintained, the photographs of your parents, the children's toys, the books, the dishes, everything that made a house a home, gone, burned to powder and blown away on the wind. This is what 10,000 people experienced in June 1921. This is where they had to start over. From nothing. Less than nothing, because they also had debt from destroyed businesses, medical bills from injuries, funeral expenses for family members murdered. They had trauma that would mark them for life. And they had a city government and white population that was hostile to their very existence. But here's the remarkable thing. Many of them decided to stay. They decided to rebuild. Not everyone. Thousands left Tulsa, joined the Great Migration North, tried to start over in Chicago, Detroit, New York, anywhere but Oklahoma. Who could blame them? Why stay in a city that tried to exterminate you? But others, maybe half the community, stayed. They'd built Greenwood once. They would build it again. The first fight was legal. Remember that fire ordinance the city passed requiring expensive fire-resistant construction? Black property owners immediately understood this was designed to force them out. If they couldn't afford to rebuild to code, white developers could buy the land cheap. This wasn't about fire safety. This was about land theft. Black attorneys, those who hadn't fled Oklahoma, filed suit. They argued the ordinance was discriminatory, that it was designed specifically to prevent black residents from rebuilding. The case went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and in October 1921, in one of the few legal victories black Tulsans would win, the court struck down the ordinance. The decision said the city couldn't impose requirements that effectively prevented property owners from rebuilding. This was crucial. It meant black residents could rebuild wooden structures if that's all they could afford. It meant they could start reconstructing immediately without waiting to accumulate money for brick or concrete construction. It was a small victory, but in the context of total destruction, small victories mattered. The rebuilding started immediately after the court decision. By November 1921, 6 months after the massacre, construction was visible throughout Greenwood. But what was being built wasn't the same as what was lost. The businesses that returned were smaller. The homes were more modest. The grand vision of Black Wall Street was replaced by the pragmatic reality of what people could afford, with no insurance money, no city assistance, and limited credit. The churches led the rebuilding effort, just as they'd been the backbone of the original Greenwood. Mount Zion Baptist Church, which had been completely destroyed, began rebuilding within months. The congregation held services in temporary structures while they raised money for a new building. First Baptist Church did the same. These churches weren't just places of worship. They were community centers, meeting places, symbols of resilience. Rebuilding them was about more than religion. It was about refusing to be erased. By 1922, some businesses had reopened. John and Lula Williams rebuilt the Dreamland Theater, though the new building was smaller than the original. They reopened the confectionery. They were determined that their businesses would survive, that their place in the community would continue. But the cost was enormous, not just financial, but emotional. Every day they ran those businesses was a reminder of what was lost. New businesses opened too. Greenwood wasn't just rebuilding what was destroyed, it was continuing to grow. By 1925, Greenwood had recovered some of its commercial vitality. There were grocery stores, barbershops, restaurants, law offices, medical practices. Not 300 businesses like before, but enough to serve the community. The district was functioning again, even if diminished. But here's what was lost that could never be rebuilt. Trust. The trust that allowed Greenwood to flourish in the first place. Before the massacre, Black Tulsans believed that if they followed the rules, worked hard, built legitimate businesses, and accumulated wealth legally, they would be safe. The massacre destroyed that belief. Now everyone knew prosperity made you a target. Success invited violence. No matter how successful you became, white supremacy could take it away in a day. This psychological damage was as significant as the physical destruction. Black families who rebuilt did so knowing it could all be taken again. Some chose not to rebuild as prosperously. Why accumulate wealth that could be stolen? Why build a nice home that could be burned? Better to stay below the radar, to be comfortable, but not too successful, to avoid attracting attention. The massacre had achieved what Jim Crow laws alone couldn't. It had terrorized Black Tulsans into accepting limits on their ambitions. The individual trauma was profound. Let me tell you about some specific survivors and how they carried the massacre for the rest of their lives. Olivia Hooker was 6 years old during the massacre. She hid under her family's dining room table while white men ransacked their home. She watched through the table legs as they poured oil on her mother's furniture before burning it. She saw them dig up her mother's carefully tended tulip garden, destroying it for no reason except cruelty. That trauma marked her entire life. But Olivia Hooker refused to be defined only by that trauma. She went on to become a groundbreaking figure. During World War II, she became one of the first Black women to join the U.S. Coast Guard. After the war, she earned a PhD in psychology and spent her career studying trauma, particularly childhood trauma. You think her research wasn't influenced by her own experience? You think watching your home destroyed at age 6 didn't shape her entire understanding of psychological damage? Olivia Hooker lived to be 103 years old. She died in 2018. For nearly a century, she carried the memory of the massacre. In her later years, she spoke openly about it, testifying before committees, giving interviews, ensuring the story wouldn't die with her generation. She was one of the last living links to 1921, and she used that position to demand justice. George Monroe was 5 years old during the massacre. His family hid in a crawlspace under their house while the violence raged above them. He heard gunfire, screaming, the sound of things breaking and burning. He heard his mother praying, desperately, quietly, trying not to make noise that would attract the mob. He spent hours in that crawlspace, terrified, not understanding what was happening or why. George Monroe didn't talk about the massacre for 70 years, not to his children, not to his friends. He buried it deep inside and tried to live his life. But trauma doesn't disappear just because you don't talk about it. It manifests in other ways: anxiety, depression, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting people. Monroe struggled with all of this, but never connected it to his childhood trauma, or at least never spoke about that connection. It wasn't until the 1990s, when he was in his 80s, that George Monroe finally told his story publicly. He participated in interviews for historical documentaries. He spoke at community events, and he said something telling. We were told never to talk about what happened. For decades, I felt like talking about it was dangerous, like something bad would happen if I did. It took me 70 years to realize I was still hiding in that crawlspace. That's what the cover-up did. It didn't just hide the massacre from history. It trapped survivors in their trauma, made them afraid to process what they'd experienced, forced them to carry their pain in silence. The psychological damage compounded across decades. Kenny Booker was a child during the massacre. He watched his father shot by white attackers. He watched his mother carry him miles to safety, running while pregnant, desperate to save her children. His father died from his wounds days later, never receiving proper medical care because Black Tulsans couldn't access white hospitals, and Greenwood's hospital had been destroyed. Kenny Booker grew up without a father because of the massacre. He grew up in poverty because the family's business was destroyed, and his mother couldn't rebuild it alone. He grew up with nightmares that persisted into adulthood. He dealt with PTSD before anyone used that term. And he dealt with anger, deep, justified anger, at a system that killed his father and faced no consequences. Booker became a pastor. He used his faith to process his trauma, to find some way to live with what he'd experienced. But even faith couldn't erase the pain or the injustice. In his sermons, he sometimes talked about forgiveness, about letting go of anger, about moving forward. But he also talked about justice, about accountability, about the need to confront evil rather than ignore it. His theology was shaped by his trauma. These three survivors, Hooker, Monroe, Booker, represent thousands of others who carried similar trauma. Each survivor had a story of loss, of terror, of injustice. Each one dealt with it differently. Some became activists, some withdrew into silence, some turned to religion or community work or education, but all of them were marked by what happened in 1921. And they passed that trauma to their children, not always explicitly. Sometimes children grew up sensing that something terrible had happened, but not knowing what. They noticed their parents' fear, their reluctance to trust white people, their warnings to be careful, to not attract attention, to always be aware of danger. This hypervigilance, this sense that safety is conditional and temporary, became part of Black Tulsa's cultural inheritance. Let's talk about money, not in an abstract way, but in a specific, calculable way. Because the true cost of the Tulsa Massacre isn't just the immediate property damage, it's the generational wealth that was stolen and never recovered. In 1921, the estimated property damage was $1.5 to $2 million. In today's dollars, that's about $27 to $35 million. That's substantial. But that's not the real loss. The real loss is what that wealth would have become over the next century if it hadn't been destroyed. Let me explain with a specific example. O.W. Gurley owned multiple properties in Greenwood in 1921. His land and buildings were worth approximately $150,000 in 1921 dollars, about $2.6 million today. But if Gurley had been able to keep those properties, maintain them, collect rent, reinvest profits, and pass them to his children, what would they be worth now? Conservative estimates suggest tens of millions of dollars. Instead, Gurley got nothing. His properties were destroyed. Insurance didn't pay. He couldn't afford to fully rebuild. He eventually left Tulsa and died in California in 1935. His wealth lost. His dreams destroyed. His descendants inherited nothing except the story of what was taken from them. Multiply that by the hundreds of property owners in Greenwood. Each one lost not just current value, but future value. Their children couldn't inherit property. Their grandchildren couldn't benefit from family wealth. The compounding effect of wealth across generations, which is how most wealthy families in America built their fortunes, was denied to Black Tulsans. Think about white Tulsa families in 1921. Many of them made fortunes in the oil boom. They bought property, started businesses, made investments. That wealth compounded over decades. Today, their great-grandchildren are still benefiting from those early 20th century fortunes. They inherit property, trust funds, business connections, access to capital. They start life with advantages that most people can't access. Now think about Black Tulsa families in 1921. They built similar wealth through different means: businesses, property, professional practices. They should have been able to pass that wealth to future generations. Their great-grandchildren should be benefiting from those early 20th century achievements. But instead, those descendants started with nothing. Or less than nothing, because the trauma and the poverty created barriers that compounded across generations. Economists have tried to calculate this loss. Conservative estimates suggest that each family that lost property in the massacre lost between $100,000 and $200,000 in potential generational wealth. That's the value their property would have accumulated if it had been passed down through 4 generations with normal appreciation and investment returns. For the community as a whole, the loss is in the billions. Literally billions of dollars in wealth that should exist in Black Tulsa, but doesn't. That money would have funded college educations, business startups, home purchases, retirement savings, everything that wealth enables. Instead, descendants of massacre survivors have struggled with poverty, limited opportunities, and the ongoing effects of stolen wealth. But it's not just about money. It's about what money provides: stability, security, options. If your grandparents owned property, you have a safety net. If your parents inherited wealth, you can take risks that others can't. You can start a business knowing failure won't destroy you. You can attend college without crippling debt. You can buy a home with help for the down payment. You can retire comfortably, knowing you won't be a burden on your children. Descendants of massacre survivors didn't have these advantages. They started each generation from scratch or close to it. They couldn't afford to fail. They couldn't take the same risks. They had to be more cautious, more conservative, more focused on immediate survival rather than long-term building. This is the ripple effect of stolen wealth. And there's the psychological component. Growing up knowing that your family once had wealth, that your great-grandfather owned a successful business, that your great-grandmother's home was beautiful, and that it was all taken by violence, that shapes your worldview. It creates a sense of precarity, a belief that what you build can be taken. It makes it hard to plan for the future when history taught you that the future can be stolen. Let me trace what happened to Greenwood through the decades after 1921, because the story doesn't end with the rebuilding. It's a story of slow decline, of dreams deferred, of a community that survived but never fully recovered. 1920s to 1930s. The rebuilding continues, but Greenwood is smaller than before. The Great Depression hits everyone hard, but Black Tulsans have less cushion because they never recovered from 1921. Businesses close. Families struggle. The district maintains some vitality, but it's a shadow of Black Wall Street's glory days. 1940s. World War II brings some economic revival. Black Tulsans work in war industries. Veterans return with new skills and GI Bill benefits. Greenwood experiences a small renaissance. New businesses open, some prosperity returns, but it's still not what it was in 1921. 1950s to 1960s. Civil rights era. Legal segregation finally ends, which you'd think would be good for Black businesses. But integration has a double-edged effect. Black consumers can now shop at white stores, and many do because they're bigger and better stocked. Black businesses in Greenwood lose customers. The very segregation that created Black Wall Street's economic success is ended, but without reparations or compensation for what was destroyed. Also in the 1950s, urban renewal. Across America, urban renewal becomes code for destroying Black neighborhoods to build highways and redevelop land. Tulsa follows this pattern. Interstate 244 is built, and guess where it goes? Right through Greenwood. Dozens of homes and businesses are demolished for the highway. The community is physically divided by a concrete barrier. This is sometimes called Negro removal, because that's what it accomplishes. 1960s to 1970s. Greenwood declines further. Young Black people leave for opportunities elsewhere. Businesses close as customers leave. Buildings fall into disrepair. The area becomes economically depressed. The prosperity of 1921 is a distant memory. Even the rebuilding of the 1920s is crumbling. 1980s to 1990s, crack epidemic and urban decay. Greenwood, like many black urban neighborhoods, is devastated by drugs, crime, and disinvestment. Police patrol heavily, but don't protect effectively. The district that was once the pride of Black America becomes associated with poverty and crime. The transformation is complete and tragic. 2000s. Some revitalization efforts begin. Historical markers are placed. People start talking about preserving what's left of Greenwood's history. But by now, most of the original buildings are gone. The community is dispersed. Greenwood as a distinct, thriving black business district essentially no longer exists. This trajectory, from prosperity to destruction to diminished rebuilding to slow decline, is the long-term impact of the massacre. It's not just that Black Wall Street was destroyed in 1921. It's that it could never fully recover because the economic foundation was stolen and never returned. Compare this to white Tulsa's trajectory. In 1921, Tulsa had about 100,000 people and was growing rapidly because of oil. Despite the massacre, or perhaps because of it, because white Tulsans looted substantial wealth from Greenwood, white Tulsa continued to prosper. The oil industry boomed. Fortunes were made. The city built museums, universities, cultural institutions. Wealth accumulated and compounded. Today, Tulsa is a mid-sized American city with all the expected amenities, and many of its wealthiest families trace their fortunes back to the oil boom era that included 1921. That's the comparison. That's what was stolen from Black Tulsans. Not just the buildings burned in 1921, but a century of prosperity that should have followed. For 50 years, the Tulsa Race Massacre was effectively erased from public memory. Survivors lived with their trauma in silence. Schools didn't teach it. History books didn't mention it. Even in Tulsa, many people born after 1921 grew up not knowing it happened. The cover-up was remarkably successful. But truth has a way of emerging, even when powerful people try to bury it. In the 1970s, the silence began to crack. Ed Wheeler, a white journalist in Tulsa, started researching the massacre in the early 1970s. He interviewed survivors, many of whom were elderly by then, and willing to talk about what they'd been forced to hide for decades. Wheeler published articles in local papers, wrote a comprehensive account, started giving public talks. His work was met with hostility from Tulsa's white establishment. He was told he was stirring up trouble, dredging up the past, hurting the city's reputation. But he persisted. Around the same time, a few black historians and community leaders began pressing for recognition. They organized commemoration events on the anniversary of the massacre. They contacted descendants of survivors. They started collecting oral histories before the last survivors died. This grassroots effort kept the memory alive, even when official institutions ignored it. In the 1990s, momentum built. The Oklahoma legislature, finally acknowledging this gap in state history, created the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. Notice the language. They still called it a riot rather than a massacre. That would change, but slowly. The Commission's work from 1997 to 2001 was groundbreaking. They interviewed survivors, by then in their 80s and 90s, the last living witnesses to 1921. They researched archives, found documents that had survived the cover-up, located photographs that had been hidden. They consulted historians, legal experts, economists. They produced a comprehensive report that, for the first time in Oklahoma's official history, told the truth about what happened. The Commission's findings were damning. They concluded that 1. The massacre was not a spontaneous riot, but a coordinated attack with government participation. 2. The death toll was far higher than 36, likely between 100 and 300. 3. Mass graves existed and should be located. 4. The legal system failed Black Tulsans completely. 5. Insurance companies committed fraud by denying all claims. 6. The cover-up was systematic and deliberate. 7. Survivors and descendants deserved compensation. The commission recommended several remedies: direct payments to survivors and descendants, scholarship programs for descendants, economic development in the Greenwood area, continued search for mass graves, creation of memorials and museums, inclusion of the massacre in school curricula. The Oklahoma legislature received the report in 2001. They acknowledged its findings. They praised the work of the commission, and then they did almost nothing about it. No reparations were paid. No comprehensive compensation program was created. The scholarship program was established, but woefully underfunded. Economic development in Greenwood remained limited. The legislature couldn't bring itself to follow through on the commission's recommendations. Survivors were outraged. They'd finally been vindicated. Oklahoma officially acknowledged what happened, admitted it was worse than claimed, recognized the ongoing harm. But vindication without compensation is just more injustice. It's saying, yes, we stole from you. Yes, it was terrible. But no, we're not giving anything back. In 2003, survivors and descendants filed a federal lawsuit seeking reparations. The lawsuit named the state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa, and other defendants. It sought compensation for property loss, personal injury, and ongoing harm. The plaintiffs argued that the statute of limitations shouldn't apply because the cover-up prevented them from knowing the full extent of their claims earlier. The case was Alexander v. Oklahoma. It wound through the courts, generating hope among survivors that finally, after more than 80 years, they might receive justice. But in 2004, the district court dismissed the case on statute of limitations grounds. The plaintiffs appealed. In 2005, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the dismissal. The plaintiffs sought Supreme Court review. In 2006, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. That was it. No compensation, no reparations. The legal system that had failed Black Tulsans in 1921 failed them again in 2003 to 2006. The message was clear. Too much time has passed. The law can't help you. Your claims are too old. Your suffering doesn't warrant remedy. Imagine being a survivor in your 90s, watching this unfold. You've lived your entire life with the trauma. You've watched your family struggle with stolen wealth's consequences. You've waited decades to even be allowed to speak about what happened. And when you finally tell your story, when Oklahoma finally admits you were wronged, the courts say, "Sorry, too late, we can't help you." Otis Clark, a survivor interviewed in 1999 before his death, said, "They bombed us from the air. They shot us in the streets. And then they told us to forget it ever happened." How do you forget something like that? Now they say, yes, it happened. Yes, it was terrible. But no, we can't pay you because too much time has passed. Time passed because they made us be quiet. Wes Young, another survivor interviewed in 2000, said, "I lost my childhood that day. I lost my innocence. I lost my belief that America meant what it said in those history books about justice and equality. And now I'm supposed to accept that justice is still denied because of a technicality? After everything they did to us, after everything they took, they can't even give us this." These quotes capture the frustration and pain of survivors who were denied justice twice. Once in 1921 and again in 2003 to 2006. They'd lived long enough to see the truth acknowledged, but not long enough to see it remedied. Most of the survivors who filed suit died before it was resolved. They died without compensation, without reparations, without the material justice they deserved. But the legal failure didn't end the fight. Descendants continued organizing. Community activists kept pressing for reparations. Historians continued researching. And public awareness grew, especially after 2016, when HBO's Watchmen series opened with a dramatization of the massacre. Millions of Americans saw it depicted on screen, many learning about it for the first time. "How did I never hear about this?" became a common response. That question itself is damning. How does one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history get omitted from history books, from school curricula, from the national narrative? The answer is what this entire documentary has been about: deliberate erasure, systematic cover-up, generations of silence enforced by threats and intimidation. By 2020 to 2021, as the 100th anniversary approached, Tulsa could no longer ignore its history. National media coverage increased. President Biden visited Tulsa and met with the 3 surviving eyewitnesses. Politicians gave speeches acknowledging the massacre. Promises were made about memorials and education and economic development. But survivors wanted more than acknowledgement. They wanted compensation. 3 survivors, Viola Fletcher, Leslie Benningfield Randall, and Hughes Van Ellis, filed a new lawsuit in 2021 seeking reparations. They were 107, 107, and 100 years old, respectively. Think about that. Living 100 plus years, carrying this trauma, still fighting for justice. Viola Fletcher testified before Congress in 2021. She said, "I am 107 years old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will." Her words carried the weight of a century of injustice. Here was a woman who witnessed the massacre as a child, who lived through a century of silence and denial, who was still seeking recognition of what was stolen from her. That new lawsuit is still pending as of this recording. The survivors are hoping that this time, maybe this time, the legal system will provide remedy. But hope is tempered by experience. They've seen too many promises broken, too many apologies without action, too much acknowledgement without compensation. Hughes Van Ellis died in October 2023 at age 102, before seeing the resolution of the lawsuit. He spent his entire life, more than a century, waiting for justice that never came. Viola Fletcher and Leslie Randall remain, fighting in their final years for what should have been given generations ago. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre is not ancient history. It's living history. There are people alive today who experienced it. There are children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who live with its economic and psychological consequences. And there are survivors, now in their hundreds, who might die before ever receiving the justice they deserve. That's the tragedy. Not just what happened in 1921, but everything that came after. The cover-up, the silence, the denial, the broken promises, the legal failures, the century of injustice compounding on top of the original injustice. The massacre destroyed Black Wall Street in 1921. But America's response to the massacre, or rather America's lack of response, has destroyed so much more. Let's talk about reparations, not in abstract philosophical terms, but in concrete, practical terms. Because when survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre ask for reparations, they're not asking for charity. They're asking for compensation for documented theft. They're asking for what was stolen to be returned, with interest. They're asking for the most basic principle of justice. When you take something that doesn't belong to you, you give it back. The concept of reparations isn't new or radical. It has precedent in American law and in international law. After World War II, Germany paid reparations to Holocaust survivors and to the State of Israel. These payments continued for decades, totaling billions of dollars. The principle was simple: an atrocity was committed, people were harmed, compensation is owed. No amount of money can restore murdered lives, but it can acknowledge the wrong and provide material support to survivors and descendants. The United States itself has paid reparations before. In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided $20,000 to each surviving Japanese American who was interned during World War II. This was 43 years after the internment ended. The government acknowledged the wrong, apologized, and paid compensation. Not full compensation. You can't put a price on freedom stolen, but meaningful recognition of harm done. Native American tribes have received various forms of compensation for land theft and broken treaties, though nowhere near adequate to the scale of what was taken. The point is, America knows how to do reparations when it wants to. The mechanism exists. The precedent exists. The only question is political will. So when Oklahoma refuses to pay reparations to Tulsa Massacre survivors and descendants, it's not because reparations are impossible or unprecedented, it's because Oklahoma chooses not to. That's an important distinction. Let's examine the arguments made against reparations, because understanding them reveals a lot about how America thinks about race, justice, and accountability. Argument 1. It happened too long ago. This argument says that because the massacre occurred over 100 years ago, it's too late to provide compensation. But this logic falls apart under scrutiny. First, as mentioned, America paid Japanese internment survivors 43 years after the fact. Holocaust survivors received compensation 50 years and more after the Holocaust. Time doesn't erase theft or make injustice acceptable. Second, the harm isn't just historical. It's ongoing. The wealth stolen in 1921 would have compounded over generations. Descendants of massacre victims are poorer today because of what was taken from their grandparents. The economic impact continues. When harm is ongoing, the claim for remedy doesn't expire. Third, the reason so much time passed is because of the cover-up. Oklahoma systematically suppressed information about the massacre for 80 years. Survivors were threatened into silence. Evidence was destroyed. The story was erased from history books. You can't use the passage of time as an excuse when you're the one who made sure time would pass before the truth came out. Argument 2. Current citizens aren't responsible. This argument says that people living in Oklahoma today didn't participate in the 1921 massacre, so they shouldn't have to pay for it. But this misunderstands how government works and how intergenerational harm functions. Governments are continuous entities. The state of Oklahoma that existed in 1921 is the same legal entity as the state of Oklahoma today. When a government commits a wrong, the government owes remedy, regardless of who currently holds office. We accept this principle in other contexts. Government bonds issued decades ago must still be honored. Contracts signed by previous administrations still bind current governments. Debts don't disappear when new people get elected. Moreover, current Oklahomans do benefit from the 1921 massacre, even if they don't realize it. Property stolen from black Tulsans often ended up in white hands. Wealth accumulated by white families after 1921 was sometimes built partly on stolen black wealth. Economic advantages compound over generations. White Tulsans today, on average, are wealthier than black Tulsans partly because of generational wealth accumulation that was denied to black families. This doesn't mean individual white Oklahomans are personally guilty of the massacre, but it does mean they benefit from systems and structures built on that injustice. Reparations aren't about personal guilt. They're about correcting systemic wrong. Argument 3. We can't identify who should receive compensation. This is a practical objection. How do we determine who's a descendant of massacre victims? Aren't the genealogical records too spotty? Won't people falsely claim descendancy? But this problem has been solved in other reparations programs. Holocaust survivors were identified and verified. Japanese internment survivors were identified and verified. It requires work, yes. It requires establishing documentation standards and verification processes. But it's not impossible. Genealogical records exist. Survivor testimony exists. Property records from 1921 show who owned what. We have the tools to do this, if we have the will. The better question is, why are opponents of reparations so concerned about false positives, people who might wrongly receive compensation, and so unconcerned about false negatives, legitimate descendants who would be denied? This priority reveals a lot about whose interests are being protected. Argument 4. It's too expensive. The estimated cost of comprehensive reparations for Tulsa Massacre descendants ranges from $100 million to $300 million, depending on how compensation is calculated. That's significant money. Oklahoma's annual state budget is over $8 billion. Tulsa's annual city budget is over $1 billion. So, reparations would be expensive, but not impossibly so. Put it in perspective. Oklahoma regularly gives tax breaks to oil companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Tulsa built a new baseball stadium that cost $60 million. The state finds money for what it prioritizes. When people say reparations are too expensive, what they mean is, we don't want to prioritize this. Moreover, the cost of not paying reparations is also high. The ongoing poverty in parts of North Tulsa, the crime, the social dysfunction, these have costs. Police costs, incarceration costs, lost economic productivity. Addressing root causes through reparations might actually be cheaper, long-term, than managing symptoms. Argument 5. It would set a bad precedent. This argument fears that paying Tulsa reparations would open floodgates to other claims. What about slavery reparations? What about other race massacres? What about Native American claims? If we pay one, we'll have to pay all. First response: good. If multiple injustices deserve remedy, then remedy should be provided. The existence of multiple wrongs doesn't excuse any of them. Second response: each case can be evaluated on its own merits. Tulsa reparations don't automatically determine slavery reparations, which is a different and more complex question. We're capable of distinguishing between different claims and different types of harm. Third response: the floodgates argument is used by those who oppose any reparations ever. It's a way to say no without saying no. If you believe that documented theft should be compensated, then sometimes the answer will be yes. If that makes you uncomfortable, examine why. Now, having demolished the arguments against, let's look at the positive case for reparations. The case for reparations. Documented theft. We know exactly what was taken. Property records show who owned what. Insurance claims document value. We have photographs of the destruction. This isn't speculative or vague. This is documented, verifiable theft on a massive scale. No compensation ever given. Unlike some historical wrongs where partial remedy was eventually provided, Tulsa Massacre victims received literally nothing. Zero insurance payouts. Zero government assistance. Zero compensation of any kind. The debt is entirely unpaid. Identifiable harm. The economic damage is calculable. Economists can estimate the compounding value of stolen wealth. We can determine how much poorer descendants are because of what was taken. This isn't abstract harm. This is measurable, quantifiable damage. Living victims. As of this recording, survivors still live. They can testify to what was taken. They can receive compensation directly. This isn't distant history. These are people who experienced the trauma and can personally benefit from remedy. Moral obligation. Even if legal obstacles exist, Oklahoma has a moral duty to make this right. The state participated in the destruction. State officials helped cover it up. State courts denied insurance claims. State government has been complicit from beginning to end. Morally, the debt is clear. Practical benefits. Reparations would provide capital to a community that desperately needs it. That money would circulate in North Tulsa, starting businesses, buying homes, funding education. It would have multiplier effects throughout the local economy. Reparations aren't just moral, they're economically sound. The legal battles over Tulsa reparations reveal how American law often protects property rights over human rights. The statute of limitations, the legal principle that you can't sue after a certain time period, was used to dismiss survivors' claims. But think about what that means. The law protected the theft by making it irreversible after time passed. The 2003 Alexander v. Oklahoma lawsuit sought to overcome the statute of limitations by arguing that the cover-up prevented plaintiffs from knowing the full extent of their claims earlier. This is called fraudulent concealment, when someone hides a wrong to prevent you from suing about it. Oklahoma destroyed evidence, suppressed the story, threatened survivors. Surely that should extend the time allowed to sue. But the courts said no. The statute of limitations was absolute. It didn't matter that Oklahoma had worked to prevent the claims from being filed earlier. It didn't matter that the cover-up was systematic and deliberate. The law, the court said, is clear. Too much time has passed. Case dismissed. This reveals something fundamental about American law. It often serves to protect the status quo rather than to provide justice. Property rights, including the right to keep what you've stolen if enough time passes, are sacrosanct. But human rights, the right to remedy for documented harm, can be dismissed on technicalities. Survivors who filed the 2003 suit were in their 80s and 90s. They'd waited their entire lives for justice. They'd been silenced for decades. They'd finally been allowed to speak. Oklahoma had finally acknowledged what happened. And then the court said, "Sorry, too late. You should have sued earlier." Earlier when? When you were being threatened? When evidence was being destroyed? When the story was suppressed? The cruelty of this is staggering. And it's not unusual in American legal history. The law has consistently been used to deny Black Americans remedy for documented wrongs. Reconstruction amendments were undermined by court decisions. Civil rights legislation was weakened by interpretation. And now, 100 years after the Tulsa Massacre, the law still protects the theft. But while legal justice was denied, historical truth continued emerging. And one of the most significant developments was the search for and discovery of mass graves. For 80 years, survivors testified that they'd seen mass graves dug. They described watching bodies loaded onto trucks. They remembered hearing about burial sites. White Tulsans either denied this or claimed not to know. Official records said nothing about mass graves. The documented death toll of 36 didn't require mass graves. 36 bodies could be buried individually. But Black Tulsa knew. The knowledge was passed down through generations. Survivors would point to locations. There's one in Oaklawn Cemetery. They buried bodies at New Block Park. Some were put under the railroad tracks. The knowledge existed in the community, even when official history denied it. In 1997, when the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot began its work, investigating mass graves became a priority. If mass graves existed, they would prove that the death toll was far higher than claimed. They would be physical evidence of the massacre's true scale. The commission hired archaeologists and used ground-penetrating radar to scan suspected locations. At Oaklawn Cemetery, radar showed anomalies consistent with disturbed earth and buried objects. At New Block Park, similar findings. The evidence suggested survivors were telling the truth, but actually excavating was complicated. You need permission from property owners. You need careful archaeological method so you don't destroy evidence. You need forensic experts to examine what you find. And you need political will to proceed, despite opposition from those who'd rather not know what's buried. The first real excavation didn't happen until 2020, 99 years after the massacre. Tulsa Mayor G.T. Bynum authorized the search, making him the first Tulsa mayor to seriously pursue this. The timing, just before the 100th anniversary, wasn't coincidental. The centennial brought renewed attention, and Bynum recognized that the city had to confront its past. Excavation began at Oaklawn Cemetery in July 2020. The team used careful archaeological technique, removing soil layer by layer, screening everything, documenting every step. And they found what survivors said would be there. Mass graves. The first excavation uncovered remains of at least 12 individuals in a trench-like burial. The bodies were not in coffins. They were laid directly in the ground, quickly and without ceremony. The trench was exactly where survivors had indicated. Forensic analysis of the remains showed evidence of violent death, gunshot trauma, blunt force trauma. The pattern was consistent with massacre victims, not normal cemetery burials. Further excavations in 2021 uncovered more remains. As of this recording, more than 30 sets of remains have been exhumed from suspected massacre burial sites. DNA testing is being conducted to try to identify victims and match them to descendants. Forensic analysis continues to determine causes of death and build understanding of what happened to these people. Finding mass graves proved multiple things. First, survivors were telling the truth. For 80 years, they testified about mass burials, and for 80 years, authorities dismissed their testimony. The graves prove survivors were reliable witnesses. Everything they said deserves to be believed. Second, the death toll was far higher than 36. You don't dig mass graves for 36 people. You bury 36 people in normal graves in existing cemeteries. Mass graves mean the death toll was high enough that normal burial wasn't practical. How high? We may never know exactly, but the graves prove the official count was a lie. Third, the massacre was organized and coordinated. Mass graves don't dig themselves. Someone had to order their excavation, organize their filling, and decide to hide them. This wasn't spontaneous violence that got out of hand. This was planned destruction with deliberate cover-up. The discovery of mass graves finally gave physical evidence to what survivors had testified about for a century. Their words were no longer the only proof. Now, there were bodies. Evidence that couldn't be denied or dismissed. But the excavations also raised painful questions. These are someone's ancestors. These remains deserve proper burial. But first, shouldn't we try to identify them? Shouldn't families know what happened to their relatives? But how long do you keep remains in storage while conducting analysis? When does the search for answers become its own form of disrespect? The families of massacre victims are divided on these questions. Some want the remains analyzed exhaustively, every question answered, every identification made if possible. Others feel their ancestors have been disturbed enough that it's time to rebury them with dignity and let them rest. There's no easy answer. Both positions come from pain and from love. What's clear is that the excavations should have happened decades ago. If authorities had listened to survivors in the 1930s or 1940s or 1950s, if they'd excavated then, we might have been able to identify more victims. We might have given families closure when they most needed it. But that didn't happen because authorities didn't want to know what was buried. They preferred the lie to the truth. The mass graves are still yielding evidence. More excavations are planned. More sites will be investigated. The truth is still emerging from the earth, literally being dug up from where it was buried a century ago. This is what justice requires. The patient, painful work of excavation, not just of soil, but of history. Meanwhile, the 3 surviving eyewitnesses continued their fight. Viola Fletcher, Leslie Benningfield Randall, and Hughes Van Ellis filed their lawsuit in 2021, seeking justice in what might be their final years. In May 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the massacre, the 3 survivors testified before the House Judiciary Committee. This was remarkable. People who witnessed the massacre as children, now over 100 years old, telling Congress what happened and asking for redress. Viola Fletcher's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. I am 107 years old and have never seen justice for what happened to me and my community. I am asking for what was taken, our homes, our churches, our future. I pray that one day I will see justice. I have been praying for a long time. Think about that. A 107-year-old woman praying for justice she's never received. A woman who witnessed an atrocity as a child and carried that memory for a century without remedy. If that doesn't move you, what will? Leslie Randall testified about watching her family's home burn, about running for her life as a 6-year-old, about the terror that marked her childhood and never fully left. We are not asking for a handout, she said. We are asking for what was stolen. We are asking for America to keep its promise of justice for all. Hughes Van Ellis, the only male survivor to testify, was 100 years old. He'd been a baby during the massacre, but grew up with its aftermath. He served in World War II, came home expecting the country he fought for to honor its veterans. Instead, he lived with poverty created by stolen wealth. I am a proud man, he said, but I am a poor man. My country did that to me. The testimony moved many in Congress. Promises were made about federal support for reparations. But as of this recording, no federal reparations have been paid. The lawsuit continues in Oklahoma courts, and Hughes Van Ellis died in October 2023 at 102 before seeing resolution. He waited his entire life for justice that never came. 2 survivors remain, Viola Fletcher and Leslie Randall, both now 110 years old. They are the last living links to that day in 1921. When they die, and at 110, that day approaches, there will be no more direct witnesses. The story will be entirely historical rather than contemporary. That transition has meaning. As long as survivors live, the massacre remains a living memory, an open wound, a debt that can still be paid to those directly harmed. When they're gone, it becomes purely historical, and history is easier to ignore than living testimony. So what does Black Wall Street mean today? Why does this story matter beyond being a terrible historical event? What lessons does it teach us about America, about race, about justice, about memory? Greenwood represents what Black Americans can achieve when given opportunity and when allowed to build without interference. In 1921, just 56 years after slavery ended, Black Tulsans had created one of America's most prosperous communities. They'd built banks, theaters, hospitals, schools. They'd accumulated wealth, educated their children, created institutions. They'd proven that Black people, given a chance, could equal or exceed anyone's achievements. This matters because American racism has always claimed that Black poverty proves Black inferiority. But Greenwood proves the opposite. Black people were kept poor by design, by law, by violence. When those barriers were reduced, when Oklahoma Territory briefly allowed Black land ownership and business development, Black prosperity flourished. The problem wasn't Black capability. The problem was white supremacy. Today, when people talk about the racial wealth gap, Black Wall Street is the counterexample. Why don't Black people just build wealth like other groups, they ask. Black Wall Street is the answer. We did. And you burned it down. Multiple times. In Tulsa, in Rosewood, in Wilmington, in dozens of other communities. Every time Black Americans built wealth, white violence or white law destroyed it. But the story isn't just about Black achievement. It's also about white backlash. Greenwood's prosperity threatened white supremacy's foundational lie, that white people are naturally superior. If Black people could be as successful as white people, could accumulate as much wealth, could run businesses as competently, could create communities as beautiful, then what justified segregation? What justified discrimination? The massacre was white supremacy's answer: violence. If Black success can't be prevented by law, prevent it by terror. Make prosperity dangerous. Make achievement risky. Teach Black Americans that building anything makes you a target. This is the logic of terrorism, and it worked. Greenwood never recovered its former glory because the lesson was learned. Success invites destruction. This pattern repeats throughout American history. Reconstruction governments with Black officials were overthrown by violence. Black voting was suppressed by terrorism. Black businesses were burned by mobs. The violence wasn't random. It was strategic. It enforced hierarchy through fear. Understanding this helps us understand contemporary racial violence. The shooting at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, where a white supremacist murdered 9 Black worshipers. The Buffalo supermarket shooting, where a white supremacist targeted Black shoppers. These attacks follow the same logic as Tulsa, 1921. Destroy Black spaces, terrorize Black communities, maintain hierarchy through violence. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Tulsa story is how completely it was forgotten. This wasn't ancient history when the silence began. People who participated in the massacre lived into the 1960s and 1970s. People who witnessed it lived into the 2000s and beyond. Yet by the 1950s, many Americans had never heard of it. By the 1970s, it was nearly erased from collective memory. This erasure was deliberate. Records were destroyed. Survivors were silenced. Schools didn't teach it. Historians didn't research it. For 50 years, one of the worst incidents of racial violence in American history was treated as if it never happened. How is that possible in a country that prides itself on truth and transparency? The answer is uncomfortable. America forgets what America wants to forget. We remember the history that makes us feel good, the triumphs, the heroism, the progress. We forget or minimize the history that makes us uncomfortable. The massacres, the terrorism, the systematic oppression. Tulsa was forgotten because remembering it requires confronting ugly truths about American racism, about law enforcement participation in racial violence, about Northern complicity. Many Tulsa attackers had migrated from northern states, about American capitalism's relationship with racial hierarchy. The forgetting wasn't passive. It was active policy by those in power. And it worked. Which raises the question, what else have we forgotten? What other massacres, what other injustices, what other truths have been successfully suppressed? Tulsa was only remembered because survivors refused to stay silent forever. How many other stories died with their survivors because the silencing was more complete? Today's racial wealth gap is directly connected to events like the Tulsa Massacre. The median white family has about 8 times the wealth of the median black family. This gap exists not because of different work ethics or different values. It exists because of systematic theft and exclusion over generations. Tulsa is a microcosm of this larger story. Black families accumulated wealth. That wealth was stolen. Insurance didn't compensate them. The legal system didn't help them. They couldn't pass wealth to their children. Their children started with nothing. Their grandchildren started with nothing. And today, descendants of Tulsa Massacre victims are, on average, far poorer than descendants of white Tulsans who lived in 1921, some of whom literally stole from black Tulsans and built generational wealth from that theft. Multiply this by every other instance of racial violence, every discriminatory law, every redlining policy, every exclusionary practice. The cumulative effect is the wealth gap we see today. It's not mysterious. It's not cultural. It's the predictable result of systematic theft and exclusion. Tulsa also helps us understand contemporary debates about police violence. In 1921, Tulsa police didn't just fail to protect black residents. They actively participated in the attack. They deputized the mob. They arrested the victims. They helped cover up the crimes. The entire law enforcement apparatus was complicit in racial violence. This isn't ancient history without modern relevance. The relationship between police and black communities has been marked by violence and betrayal from slavery through Jim Crow, through the Civil Rights era, to today. Black Americans' distrust of police isn't paranoia. It's learned experience across generations. When police participated in massacring your grandparents' community, you don't easily trust police to protect your community. Contemporary police violence against black Americans, the shootings, the brutality, the over-policing, exists in this historical context. It's not aberration, it's continuation. The specific tactics change, but the pattern of police serving to control black communities rather than protect them remains consistent. Finally, Black Wall Street challenges fundamental American mythology. America tells itself stories about steady progress, about expanding rights, about equal opportunity. The American dream says anyone can succeed through hard work. The civil rights narrative says we overcame racism, and now we're all equal. Tulsa exposes these stories as incomplete at best, false at worst. Black Tulsans did everything right. They worked hard. They built businesses. They accumulated wealth legally. They followed every rule, and America destroyed them for it. The American dream, for them, became the American nightmare. The civil rights narrative of steady progress is also complicated by Tulsa. The massacre happened in 1921, after slavery ended, but before the civil rights movement. Black Tulsans weren't asking for integration. They weren't challenging white spaces. They were building their own separate community, accepting segregation's terms, and white Tulsa still destroyed them. This suggests that the problem wasn't black people overreaching or demanding too much. The problem was black success itself. Moreover, the fact that Tulsa was forgotten for 80 years undermines the progress narrative. If we've made so much progress, why did it take until the 1990s to officially acknowledge this massacre? Why are survivors still seeking justice in their hundreds? Why has meaningful reparation not been paid? The distance between American rhetoric about justice and American reality of injustice is vast, and Tulsa marks that distance clearly. So here we are, more than a century after the massacre. The story is finally being told widely. The truth is finally acknowledged. The mass graves are finally being excavated, but justice is still denied. Reparations are still refused, and the two surviving eyewitnesses are waiting in their 110th year of life for America to keep its promise. What should happen? The answer is straightforward. Immediate reparations. Pay the survivors. Viola Fletcher and Leslie Randall deserve compensation for what was stolen from them. They've waited 103 years. Pay them now, while they live, not as charity, as debt owed. Descendant compensation. Establish a fund for verified descendants of massacre victims. Compensate them for generational wealth stolen. Use the Japanese internment model. Establish standards. Verify claims. Pay. Community investment. Invest heavily in North Tulsa. Economic development, education, housing, infrastructure. Not as reparations, this is separate, but as recognition that the area has been systematically neglected for a century. Full accounting. Continue excavating mass graves. Identify every victim possible. Give families closure. Build a comprehensive memorial listing every name. Educational mandate. Require the massacre to be taught in every Oklahoma school. Provide curricula, train teachers, make it mandatory. Extend this nationally. Every American should learn this history. Legal reform. Address the statute of limitations issue. When government covers up crimes, the time to sue should extend. Change the law to prevent future victims from being denied justice on technicalities. Acknowledgement and apology. A full formal apology from Oklahoma and from the United States. Not vague regret. Specific acknowledgement of what was done, who did it, and how government was complicit. This isn't radical. This is basic justice. This is what should have happened in 1922. That it didn't happen then is tragedy. That it still hasn't happened is ongoing injustice. The story of Black Wall Street is not over. It continues every day that justice is denied. It continues every day that survivors wait. It continues every day that descendants live with poverty created by theft. It continues every day that America refuses to confront its history honestly. But the story can have a different ending. If we choose to act, if we demand reparations, if we insist on justice, if we refuse to let this story be forgotten again. Viola Fletcher said she prays every day for justice. She's 110 years old. How much longer should she pray? How much longer should she wait? How much longer should any survivor or descendant wait for America to keep its promises? The answer should be, not one more day. Justice delayed is justice denied, and 103 years is not delay, it's denial. Black Wall Street was destroyed in 1921, but its memory survives, its lessons endure, and its demand for justice remains, echoing across a century, calling us to finally do what's right. The question is not what happened in Tulsa in 1921. We know what happened. The question is what we will do about it now. Will we continue the denial? Continue the excuses? Continue letting time erase responsibility? Or will we finally provide the justice that survivors have sought for more than a century? That question is addressed not to history, but to us. Right now. Today. What will we do? How will we answer? History is watching. The survivors are waiting. And time is running out.